Chapter 14 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Spring came early that year at White Slides Ranch. The snow melted off the valleys, and the wild flowers peeped from the greening grass, while yet the mountain domes were white. The long stone slides were glistening wet, and the brooks ran full-banked, noisy and turbulent and roily. Soft and fresh of colour, the grey old sage slopes came out from under their winter mantle. The bleached tufts of grass waved in the wind and showed tiny blades of green at the roots. The aspens and oaks, and the vines on fences and cliffs, and the round-clumped brook-bordering willows took on a hue of spring. The mustangs and colts in the pastures snorted and ran and kicked and cavorted, and on the hillsides the cows began to climb higher, searching for the tender greens, bawling for the newborn calves. Eagles shrieked the release of the snowbound peaks, and the elks bugled their piercing calls. The grouse-cocks spread their gorgeous brown plumage in parade before their twittering mates, and the jays screeched in the woods, and the sage hens sailed along the bosom of the grey slopes. Black bears and browns and grizzlies came out of their winter's sleep and left huge muddy tracks on the trails. The timber wolves at dusk mourned their hungry calls for life, for meat, for the wildness that was passing. The coyotes yelped at sunset, joyous and sharp and impudent. But winter yielded reluctantly its hold on the mountains. The black scudding clouds and the squalls of rain and sleet and snow whitening and melting and vanishing, and the cold clear nights with crackling frost all retarded the work of the warming sun. The day came, however, when the greens held their own with the greys, and this was the assurance of nature that spring could not be denied, and that summer would follow. Bent Wade was hiding in the willows along the trail that followed one of the brooks. Of late, on several mornings, he had skulked like an Indian under cover, watching for someone. On this morning, when Columbine Belllounds came riding along, he stepped out into the trail in front of her. "Oh, Ben, you startled me!" she exclaimed, as she held hard on the frightened horse. "Good morning, Collie," replied Wade. "I'm sorry to scare you, but I'm particular anxious to see you, and considering how you avoid me these days, I had to waylay you in regular road agent style." Wade gazed up searchingly at her. It had been some time since he had been given the privilege and pleasure of seeing her close at hand. He needed only one look at her to confirm his fears. The pale, sweet, resolute face told him much. "Well, now you've waylaid me, what do you want?" she queried deliberately. "I'm going to take you to see Wills Moore," replied Wade, watching her closely. "No!" she cried, with the red staining her temples. "Collie, see here. Did I ever oppose anything you wanted to do?" "Not yet," she said. "I reckon you expect me to?" She did not answer that. Her eyes drooped and she nervously twisted the bridle reins. "Do you doubt my good intentions toward you? My love for you?" he asked in gentle and husky voice. "Oh, Ben, no, no! It's that I'm afraid of your love for me. I can't bear what I have to bear if I see you, if I listen to you. Then you've weakened. You're no proud, high-strung, thoroughbred girl any more. You're showin' yellow." "Ben Wade, I deny that," she answered, spiritedly, with an uplift of her head. "It's not weakness, but strength I've found." "Uh-huh. Well, I reckon I understand. Collie, listen. Wills let me read your last letter to him." "I expected that. I think I told him to. Anyway, I wanted you to know what ailed me." "Lass, it was a fine, brave letter, written by a girl facin' an upheaval of conscience and soul. But in your own trouble, you forget the effect that letter might have on Will's Moor." "Ben, I've lain awake at night. Oh, was he hurt?" "Collie, I reckon if you don't see Wills, he'll kill himself or kill Buster Jack," replied Wade gravely. "I'll see him," she faltered. "But, oh, Ben, you don't mean that Wilson would be so base, so cowardly?" "Collie, you're a child. You don't realize the depths to which a man can sink. Wills has had a long, hard pull this winter. My nursin' and your letters have saved his life. He's well now, but that long, dark spell of mind left its shadow on him. He's morbid." "What does he want to see me for?" asked Columbine tremulously. There were tears in her eyes. "It'll only cause more pain, make matters worse." "Reckon I don't agree with you. Wills just wants and needs to see you. Why, he appreciated your position. I've heard him cry like a woman over it, and our helplessness. What ails him is love sickness, the awful feeling which comes to a man who believes he has lost his sweetheart's love. Poor boy! So he imagines I don't love him any more. Good heavens, how stupid men are! I'll see him, Ben. Take me to him." For answer, Wade grasped the bridle of her horse and, turning him, took a course leading away behind the hill that lay between them and the ranch house. The trail was narrow and brushy, making it necessary for him to walk ahead of the horse, so the hunter did not speak to her or look at her for some time. He plodded on with his eyes downcast. Something tugged at Wade's mind, an old, familiar, beckoning thing, vague and mysterious and black, a presage of catastrophe. But it was only an opening wedge into his mind. It had not entered. Gravity and unhappiness occupied him. His senses, nevertheless, were alert. He heard the low roar of the flooded brook, the whir of rising grouse ahead, the hoofs of deer on stones, the song of spring birds. He had an eye also for the wan wild flowers in the shaded corners. Presently he led the horse out of the willows into the open and up a low-swelling, long slope of fragrant sage. Here he dropped back to Columbine's side and put his hand upon the pommel of her saddle. It was not long until her own hand softly fell upon his and clasped it. Wade thrilled under the warm touch. How well he knew her heart! When she ceased to love anyone to whom she had given her love, then she would have ceased to breathe. "Lass, this isn't the first mornin' I've waited for you," he said presently. "And when I had to go back to Will's without you, well, it was hard." "Then he wants to see me so badly?" she asked. "Reckon you've not thought much about him or me lately," said Wade. "No, I've tried to put you out of my mind. I've had so much to think of. Why, even the sleepless nights have flown." "Are you going to confide in me, as you used to?" "Ben, there's nothing to confide. I'm just where I left off in that letter to Wilson. And the more I think, the more muddled I get." Wade greeted this reply with a long silence. It was enough to feel her hand upon his and to have the glad comfort and charm of her presence once more. He seemed to have grown older lately. The fragrant breath of the sage slopes came to him as something precious he must feel and love more. A haunting transience mocked him from these rolling gray hills. Old White Slides loomed gray and dark up into the blue, grim and stern reminder of age and of fleeting time. There was a cloud on Wade's horizon. "Wills is waitin' down there," said Wade, pointing to a grove of aspens below. "Reckon it's pretty close to the house and a trail runs along there. But Wills can't ride very well yet, and this appeared to be the best place." "Ben, I don't care if Dad or Jack know I've met Wilson. I'll tell them," said Columbine. Well, if I were you, I wouldn't," he replied. They went down the slope and entered the grove. It was an open, pretty spot with grass and wild flowers and old bleached logs half sunny and half shady under the newborn, fluttering aspen leaves. Wade saw Moore sitting on his horse, and it struck the hunter significantly that the cowboy should be mounted when an hour back he had left him sitting disconsolately on a log. Moore wanted Columbine to see him first, after all these months of fear and dread, mounted upon his horse. Wade heard Columbine's glad little cry, but he did not turn to look at her then. But when they reached the spot where Moore stood, Wade could not resist the desire to see the meeting between the lovers. Columbine, being a woman, and therefore capable of hiding agitation, except in moments of stress, met that trying situation with more apparent composure than the cowboy. Moore's long, piercing gaze took the rose out of Columbine's cheeks. "Oh, Wilson, I'm so happy to see you on your horse again," she exclaimed. "It's too good to be true. I've prayed for that more than anything else. Can you get up into your saddle like you used to? Can you ride well again? Let me see your foot." Moore held out a bulky foot. He wore a shoe and it was slashed. "I can't wear a boot," he explained. "Oh, I see," exclaimed Columbine, slowly, with her glad smile fading. "You can't put that foot in a stirrup, can you?" "No." "But it will. You'll be able to wear a boot soon," she implored. "Never again, Collie," he said sadly. And then Wade perceived that, like a flash, the old spirit leaped up in Columbine. It was all he wanted to see. "Now, folks," he said, "I reckon two's company and three's a crowd. I'll go off a little ways and keep watch." "Ben, you stay here," replied Columbine hurriedly. "Why, Collie? Are you afraid or ashamed to be with me alone?" asked Moore bitterly. Columbine's eyes flashed. It was seldom they lost their sweet tranquillity, but now they had depth and fire. "No, Wilson, I'm neither afraid nor ashamed to be with you alone," she declared. "But I can be as natural, as much myself with Ben here as I could be alone. Why can't you be? If Dad and Jack heard of our meeting, the fact of Ben's presence might make it look different to them. And why should I heap trouble upon my shoulders?" "I beg pardon, Collie," said the cowboy. "I've just been afraid of things." "My horse is restless," returned Columbine. "Let's get off and talk." So they dismounted. It warmed Wade's gloomy heart to see the woman look in Columbine's eyes as she watched the cowboy get off and walk. For a crippled man he did very well, but that moment was fraught with meaning for Wade. These unfortunate lovers, brave and fine in their suffering, did not realize the peril they invited by proximity. But Wade knew. He pitied them. He thrilled for them. He lived their torture with them. "Tell me everything," said Columbine impulsively. Moore, with dragging step, approached an aspen log that lay off the ground, propped by the stump, and here he leaned for support. Columbine laid her gloves on the log. "There's nothing to tell that you don't know," replied Moore. "I wrote you all there was to write, except," here he dropped his head, "except that the last 3 weeks have been hell." "They've not been exactly heaven for me," replied Columbine, with a little laugh that gave Wade a twinge. Then the lovers began to talk about spring coming, about horses and cattle and feed, about commonplace ranch matters not interesting to them, but which seemed to make conversation and hide their true thoughts. Wade listened, and it seemed to him that he could read their hearts. "Lass, and you, Wills, you're wasting time and getting nowhere," interposed Wade. "Now let me go so you'll be alone." "You stay right there," ordered Moore. "Why, Ben, I'm ashamed to say that I actually forgot you were here," said Columbine. "Then I'll remind you," rejoined the hunter. "Collie, tell us about Old Bill and Jack." "Tell you? What?" "Well, I've seen changes in both. So has Wills, though Wills hasn't seen as much as he's heard from Lem and Montana and the Andrews boys." "Oh!" Columbine choked a little over her exclamation of understanding. Dad has gotten a new lease on life, I guess. He's happy, like a boy sometimes, and good as gold. It's all because of the change in Jack. That is remarkable. I've not been able to believe my own eyes. Since that night Jack came home and had the understanding with Dad, he's been another person. He has left me alone. He treats me with deference, but not a familiar word or look. He's kind. He offers the little civilities that occur, you know, but he never intrudes upon me. Not one word of the past. It is as if he would earn my respect and have that or nothing. Then he works as he never worked before, on Dad's books, in the shop, out on the range. He seems obsessed with some thought all the time. He talks little, all the old petulance, obstinacy, selfishness, and especially his sudden queer impulses and bull-headed tenacity, all gone. He has suffered physical distress because he never was used to hard work. And more, he's suffered terribly for the want of liquor. I've heard him say to Dad, "It's hell, this burning thirst. I never knew I had it. I'll stand it if it kills me. But wouldn't it be easier on me to take a drink now and then at these bad times?" And Dad said, "No, son, break off for keeps. This tapering off is no good way to stop drinking. Stand the burnin', and when it's gone, you'll be all the gladder, and I'll be all the prouder." I have not forgotten all Jack's former failings, but I am forgetting them, little by little. For Dad's sake I'm overjoyed. For Jack's I am glad. I'm convinced now that he's had his lesson, that he's sowed his wild oats, that he has become a man. Moore listened eagerly, and when she had concluded, he thoughtfully bent his head and began to cut little chips out of the log with his knife. "Collie, I've heard a good deal of the change in Jack," he said earnestly. "Honest Injun, I'm glad. Glad for his father's sake, for his own, and for yours. The boys think Jack's locoed, but his reformation is not strange to me. If I were no good, just like he was, well, I could change as greatly for you." Columbine hastily averted her face. Wade's keen eyes, apparently hidden under his old hat, saw how wet her lashes were, how her lips trembled. "Wilson, you think then you believe Jack will last, will stick to his new ways?" she queried hurriedly. "Yes, I do," he replied, nodding. "How good of you! Oh, Wilson, it's like you to be noble, splendid, when it'd have been so natural for you to doubt, to scorn him." "Collie, I'm honest about that. And now you be just as honest. Do you think Jack will stand to his colors, never drink, never gamble, never fly off the handle again?" "Yes, I honestly believe that. Providing I..." Her voice trailed off faintly. Moore wheeled to address the hunter. "Pard, what do you think? Tell me now, tell us. It will help me and Collie too. I've asked you before, but you wouldn't. Tell us now, do you believe Buster Jack will live up to his new ideals?" Wade had long parried that question, because the time to answer it had not come till this moment. "No," he replied gently. Columbine uttered a little cry. "Why not?" demanded Moore, his face darkening. "Reckon there are reasons that you young folks wouldn't think of and couldn't know." "Wade, it's not like you to be hopeless for any man," said Moore. "Yes, I reckon it is sometimes," replied Wade, wagging his head solemnly. "Young folks, I'm grantin' all you say as to Jack's reformation, except that it's permanent. I'm grantin' he's sincere, that he's not playing a part, that his vicious instincts are smothered under a noble impulse to be what he ought to be. It's no trick. Buster Jack has all but done the impossible." "Then why isn't his sincerity and good work to be permanent?" asked Moore impatiently, and his gesture was violent. "Wils, his change is not moral force. It's passion." The cowboy paled. Columbine stood silent, with intent eyes upon the hunter. Neither of them seemed to understand him well enough to make reply. "Love can work marvels in any man," went on Wade. "But love can't change the fiber of a man's heart. A man is born so and so. He loves and hates and feels according to the nature. It'd be according to nature for Jack Belllounds to stay reformed if his love for Collie lasted. And that's the point. It can't last. Not in a man of his stripe." "Why not?" demanded Moore. "Because Jack's love will never be returned. Satisfied. It takes a man of different caliber to love a woman who'll never love him. Jack's obsessed by passion now. He'd perform miracles. But that's not possible. The miracle necessary here would be for him to change his moral force, his blood, the habits of his mind. That's beyond his power." Columbine flung out an appealing hand. "Ben, I could pretend to love him. I might make myself love him, if that would give him the power." "Lass, don't delude yourself. You can't do that," replied Wade. "How do you know what I can do?" she queried, struggling with her helplessness. "Why, child, I know you better than you know yourself." "Wilson, he's right, she cried. "That's why it's so terrible for me now. He knows my very heart. He reads my soul. I can never love Jack Belllounds, nor ever pretend love." "Collie, if Ben knows you so well, you ought to listen to him as you used to," said Moore, touching her hand with infinite sympathy. Wade watched them. His pity and affection did not obstruct the ruthless expression of his opinions or the direction of his intentions. "Lass, an' you, Wils, listen," he said, with all his gentleness. "It's bad enough without you making it worse. Don't blind yourselves. That's the hell with so many people in trouble. It's hard to see clear when you're sufferin' and fightin'. But I see clear. Now, with just a word, I could fetch this new Jack Belllounds back to his Buster Jack tricks." "Oh, Ben! No, no, no!" cried Columbine, in a distress that showed how his force dominated her. Moore's face turned as white as ashes. Wade divined then that Moore was aware of what he himself knew about Jack Belllounds. And to his love for Moore was added an infinite respect. "I won't unless Collie forces me to," he said significantly. This was the critical moment, and suddenly Wade answered to it without restraint. He leaped up, startling Columbine. "Wils, you call me pard, don't you? I reckon you never knew me. Why, the game's most played out and I haven't showed my hand. I'd see Jack Belllounds in hell before I'd let him have Collie. And if she carried out her strange and lofty idea of duty and married him right this afternoon, I could and I would part them before night." He ended that speech in a voice neither had ever heard him use before, and the look of him must have been in harmony with it. Columbine, wide-eyed and gasping, seemed struck to the heart. Moore's white face showed awe and fear and irresponsible, primitive joy. Wade turned away from them, the better to control the passion that had mastered him, and it did not subside in an instant. He paced to and fro, his head bowed. Presently, when he faced around, it was to see what he had expected to see. Columbine was clasped in Moore's arms. "Collie, you haven't promised to marry him again?" "No. Oh, no, I haven't. I was only trying to make up my mind. Wilson, don't look at me so terribly." "You'll not agree again? You'll not set another day?" demanded Moore, passionately. He strained her to him, yet held her so he could see her face, thus dominating her with both strength and will. His face was corded now and darkly flushed. His jaw quivered. "You'll never marry Jack Belllounds. You'll not let sudden impulse sudden persuasion or force change you. Promise, swear you'll never marry him. Swear." "Oh, Wilson, I promise, I swear," she cried. "Never. I'm yours. It would be a sin. I've been mad to blind myself." "You love me! You love me!" he cried in a sudden transport. "Oh, yes, yes, I do." "Say it then. Say it so I'll never doubt, never suffer again." "I love you, Wilson. I love you unutterably," she whispered. "I love you so I'm broken hearted now. I'll never live without you. I'll die, I love you so." You flower, you angel," he whispered in return. "You woman, you precious creature. I've been crazed at loss of you." Wade paced out of earshot, and this time he remained away for a considerable time. He lived again moments of his own past, unforgettable and sad. When at length he returned toward the young couple, they were sitting apart, composed once more, talking earnestly. As he neared them, Columbine rose to greet him with wonderful eyes, in which reproach blended with affection. "Ben, so this is what you've done," she exclaimed. "Lass, I'm only a humble instrument, and I believe God guides me right," replied the hunter. "I love you more, it seems, for what you make me suffer," she said, and she kissed him with a serious sweetness. "I'm only a leaf in the storm. But let what will come. Take me home." They said good-bye to Wilson, who sat with head bowed upon his hands. His voice trembled as he answered them. Wade found the trail while Columbine mounted. As they went slowly down the gentle slope, stepping over the numerous logs fallen across the way, Wade caught out of the tail of his eye a moving object along the outer edge of the aspen grove above them. It was the figure of a man skulking behind the trees. He disappeared. Wade casually remarked to Columbine that now she could spur the pony and hurry on home. But Columbine refused. When they got a little farther on, out of sight of Moore and somewhat around to the left, Wade espied the man again. He carried a rifle. Wade grew somewhat perturbed. "Collie, you run on home," he said sharply. "Why? You've complained of not seeing me. Now that I want to be with you." "Ben, you see someone?" Columbine's keen faculties evidently sensed the change in Wade, and the direction of his uneasy glance convinced her. "Oh, there's a man! Ben, it is! Yes, it's Jack!" she exclaimed excitedly. "Reckon you'd have it better if you say Buster, Jack," replied Wade with his tragic smile. "Ah," whispered Columbine, as she gazed up at the aspen slope, with eyes lighting to battle. "Run home, Collie, and leave him to me," said Wade. "Ben, you mean he saw us up there in the grove? Saw me in Wilson's arms? Saw me kissing him?" "Sure as you're born, Collie. He watched us. He saw all your lovemaking. I can tell that by the way he walks. It's Buster Jack again. Alas for the new and noble Jack. I told you, Collie. Now you run on and leave him to me." Wade became aware that she turned at his last words and regarded him attentively. But his gaze was riveted on the striding form of Belllounds. "Leave him to you? For what reason, my friend?" she asked. "Buster Jack's on the rampage. Can't you see that? He'll insult you. He'll..." "I will not go," interrupted Columbine, and halting her pony, she deliberately dismounted. Wade grew concerned with the appearance of young Belllounds, and it was with a melancholy reminder of the infallibility of his presentiments. As he and Columbine halted in the trail, Belllounds' hurried stride lengthened until he almost ran. He carried the rifle forward in a most significant manner. Black as a thundercloud was his face. Alas for the dignity and pain and resolve that had only recently showed there. Belllounds reached them. He was frothing at the mouth. He cocked the rifle and thrust it toward Wade, holding low down. "You meddling sneak! If you open your trap I'll bore you!" he shouted almost incoherently. Wade knew when danger of life loomed imminent. He fixed his glance upon the glaring eyes of Belllounds. "Jack, seein' I'm not packin' a gun, it'd look sorta natural along with your other tricks if you bored me." His gentle voice, his cool mien, his satire were as giant's arms to drag Belllounds back from murder. The rifle was raised, the hammer reset, the butt lowered to the ground, while Belllounds, snarling and choking, fought for speech. "I'll get even with you," he said huskily. "I'm onto your game now. I'll fix you later. But I'll do you harm now if you mix in with this." Then he wheeled to Columbine, and as if he had just recognized her, a change that was pitiful and shocking convulsed his face. He leaned toward her, pointing with shaking, accusing hand. "I saw you up there. I watched you," he panted. Columbine faced him, white and mute. "It was you, wasn't it?" he yelled. "Yes, of course it was." She might have struck him for the way he flinched. "What was that? A trick, a game, a play all fixed up for my benefit?" "I don't understand you," she replied. "Pah! You white-faced cat! I saw you in Moore's arms, saw him hug you, kiss you. Then I saw you put up your arms round his neck, kiss him, kiss him, kiss him. I saw all that, didn't I?" "You must have, since you say so," she returned with perfect composure. "But did you?" he almost shrieked, the blood cording and bulging red, as if about to burst the veins of temples and neck. "Yes, I did," she flashed. There was primitive woman uppermost in her now, and a spirit no man might provoke with impunity. "You love him?" he asked, very low, incredulously, with almost insane eagerness for denial in his query. Then Wade saw the glory of her, saw her mother again in that proud, fierce uplift of face that flamed red and then blazed white, saw hate and passion and love in all their primal nakedness. "Love him? Love Wilson Moore? Yes, you fool! I love him! Yes, yes, yes!" That voice would have pierced the heart of a wooden image, so Wade thought, as all his strung nerves quivered and thrilled. Belllounds uttered a low cry of realization, and all his instinctive energy seemed on the verge of collapse. He grew limp, he sagged, he tottered. His sensorial perceptions seemed momentarily blunted. Wade divined the tragedy, and a pang of great compassion overcame him. Whatever Jack Belllounds was in character, he had inherited his father's power to love, and he was human. Wade felt the death in that stricken soul, and it was the last flash of pity he ever had for Jack Belllounds. You," muttered Belllounds, raising a hand that gathered speed and strength in the action. The moment of a great blow had passed like a storm blast through a leafless tree. Now the 1,000 devils of his nature leaped into ascendancy. "You—" He could not articulate. Dark and terrible became his energy. It was like a resistless current forced through leaping thought and leaping muscle. He struck her on the mouth, a cruel blow that would have felled her but for Wade. And then he lunged away, bowed and trembling, yet with fierce instinctive motion, as if driven to run with the spirit of his rage. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wade noticed that after her trying experience with him and Wilson and Belllounds, Columbine did not ride frequently. He managed to get a word or two with her whenever he went to the ranch house, and he needed only look at her to read her sensitive mind. All was well with Columbine, despite her trouble. She remained upheld in spirit, while yet she seemed to brood over an unsolvable problem. She had said, "But let what will come," and she was waiting. Wade hunted for more than lions and wolves these days. Like an Indian scout who scented peril or heard an unknown step upon his trail, Wade rode the hills and spent long hours hidden on the lonely slopes, watching with somber, keen eyes. They were eyes that knew what they were looking for. They had marked the strange sight of the son of Bill Belllounds gliding along that trail where Moore had met Columbine, sneaking and stooping, at last with many a covert glance about, to kneel in the trail and compare the horse tracks there with horseshoes he took from his pocket. That alone made Bent Wade eternally vigilant. He kept his counsel. He worked more swiftly so that he might have leisure for his peculiar seeking. He spent an hour each night with the cowboys, listening to their recounting of the day and to their homely and shrewd opinions. He haunted the vicinity of the ranch house at night, watching and listening for that moment which was to aid him in the crisis that was impending. Many a time he had been near when Columbine passed from the living room to her corner of the house. He had heard her sigh and could almost have touched her. Buster Jack had suffered a regurgitation of the old driving and insatiate temper, and there was gloom in the house of Belllounds. Trouble clouded the old man's eyes. May came with the spring roundup. Wade was called to use a rope and brand calves under the order of Jack Belllounds, foreman of White Slides. That roundup showed a loss of 100 head of stock, some branded steers and yearlings and many calves, in all a mixed herd. Belllounds received the amazing news with a roar. He had been ready for something to roar at. The cowboys gave as reasons winter kill and lions, and perhaps some head stolen since the thaw. Wade emphatically denied this. Very few cattle had fallen prey to the big cats, and none, so far as he could find, had been frozen or caught in drifts. It was the young foreman who stunned them all. "Rustled," he said darkly. "There's too many loafers and homesteaders in these hills." And he stalked out to leave his hearers food for reflection. Jack Belllounds drank, but no one saw him drunk, and no one could tell where he got the liquor. He rode hard and fast. He drove the cowboys one way while he went another. He had grown shifty, cunning, more intolerant than ever. Some nights he rode to Kremmling, or said he had been there, when next day the cowboys found another spent and broken horse to turn out. On other nights he coaxed and bullied them into playing poker. They won more of his money than they cared to count. Columbine confided to Wade with mournful whisper that Jack paid no attention to her whatever, and that the old rancher attributed this coldness and Jack's backsliding to her irresponsiveness and her tardiness in setting the wedding day that must be set. To this Wade had whispered in reply, "Don't ever forget what I said to you and Wills that day." So Wade upheld Columbine with his subtle dominance and watched over her, as it were, from afar. No longer was he welcome in the big living room. Belllounds reacted to his son's influence. Twice in the early mornings Wade had surprised Jack Belllounds in the blacksmith shop. The meetings were accidental, yet Wade ever remembered how coincidence beckoned him thither and how circumstance magnified strange reflections. There was no reason why Jack should not be tinkering in the blacksmith shop early of a morning. But Wade followed an uncanny guidance. Like his hound, Fox, he never split on trails. When opportunity afforded, he went into the shop and looked it over with eyes as keen as the nose of his dog. And in the dust of the floor he had discovered little circles with dots in the middle, all uniform in size. Sight of them did not shock him, until they recalled vividly the little circles with dots in the earthen floor of Wilson Moore's cabin, little marks made by the end of Moore's crutch. Wade grinned then like a wolf showing his fangs, and the vitals of a wolf could no more strongly have felt the instinct to rend. For Wade, the cloud on his horizon spread and darkened, gathered sinister shape of storm, harboring lightning and havoc. It was the cloud in his mind, the foreshadowing of his soul, the prophetic sense of like to like. Where he wandered, there the blight fell. Significant was the fact that Belllounds hired new men. Bludsoe had quit. Montana Jim grew surly these days and packed a gun. Lem Billings had threatened to leave. New and strange hands for Jack Belllounds to direct had a tendency to release a strain and tide things over. Every time the old rancher saw Wade, he rolled his eyes and wagged his head, as if combating superstition with an intelligent sense of justice. Wade knew what troubled Belllounds, and it strengthened the gloomy mood that, like a poison lichen, seemed finding root. Every day Wade visited his friend, Wilson Moore, and most of their conversation centered round that which had become a ruling passion for both. But the time came when Wade deviated from his gentleness of speech and leisure of action. "Bent, you're not like you were," said Moore once, in surprise at the discovery. "You're losing hope and confidence." "No, I've only something on my mind." "What?" "I reckon I'm not going to tell you now." "You've got hell on your mind," flashed the cowboy, in grim inspiration. Wade ignored the insinuation and turned the conversation to another subject. "Wills, you're buying stock right along." "Sure am. I saved some money, you know. And what's the use to hoard it? I'll buy cheap. In 5 years I'll have 500, maybe 1,000 head. Wade, my old dad will be pleased to find out I've made the start I have." "Well, it's a fine start, I'll allow. Have you picked up any unbranded stock?" "Sure I have. Say, pard, are you worrying about this 2-bit rustler work that's been going on?" "Wills, it ain't 2 bits any more. I reckon it's getting into the 4-bit class." "I've been careful to have my business transactions all in writing," said Moore. "It makes these fellows sore because some of them can't write, and they're not used to it. But I'm starting this game in my own way." "Have you sold any stock?" "Not yet. But the Andrews boys are driving some 30-odd head to Kremmling for me to be sold." "Ahuh. Well, I'll be going," Wade replied, and it was significant of his state of mind that he left his young friend sorely puzzled. Not that Wade did not see Moore's anxiety, but the drift of events at White Slides had passed beyond the stage where sympathetic and inspiring hope might serve Wade's purpose. Besides, his mood was gradually changing as these events, like many fibers of a web, gradually closed in toward a culminating knot. That night Wade lounged with the cowboys and new hands in front of the little storehouse where Belllounds kept supplies for all. He had lounged there before in the expectation of seeing the rancher's son. And this time anticipation was verified. Jack Belllounds swaggered over from the ranch house. He met civility and obedience now where formerly he had earned but ridicule and opposition. So long as he worked hard himself, the cowboys endured. The subtle change in him seemed of sterner stuff. The talk, as usual, centered round the stock subjects and the banter and gossip of ranch hands. Wade selected an interval when there was a lull in the conversation, and with eyes that burned under the shadow of his broad-brimmed sombrero, he watched the son of Belllounds. "Say, boys, Wils Moore has begun sellin' cattle," remarked Wade, casually. "The Andrews brothers are drivin' for him." "Wal, so Wils is spread eaglin' into a real rancher!" ejaculated Lem Billings. "Mighty glad to hear it. That boy sure will get rich." Wade's remark incited no further expressions of interest, but it was Jack Belllounds's secret mind that Wade wished to pierce. He saw the leaping of a thought that was neither interest nor indifference nor contempt, but a creative thing which lent a fleeting flash to the face, a slight shock to the body. Then Jack Belllounds bent his head, lounged there for a little while longer, lost in absorption, and presently he strolled away. Whatever that mounting thought of Jack Belllounds was, it brought instant decision to Wade. He went to the ranch house and knocked upon the living room door. There was a light within, sending rays out through the windows into the semi-darkness. Columbine opened the door and admitted Wade. A bright fire crackled in the hearth. Wade flashed a reassuring look at Columbine. "Evening, Miss Collie. Is your dad in?" "Oh, it's you, Ben," she replied after her start. "Yes, Dad's here." The old rancher looked up from his reading. "Howdy, Wade. What can I do for you?" "Belllounds, I've cleaned out the cats and most of the varmints on your range, and my work lately has been all sorts, not leaving me any time for little jobs of my own. And I want to quit." "Wade, you've clashed with Jack!" exclaimed the rancher, jerking erect. "Nothin' of the kind. Jack and me haven't had words a good while. I'm not denyin' we might, and probably would clash sooner or later, but that's not my reason for quittin'." Manifestly this put an entirely different complexion upon the matter. Belllounds appeared immensely relieved. "Well, all right. I'll pay you at the end of the month. Let's see, that's not long now. You can lay off to morrow." Wade thanked him and waited for further remarks. Columbine had fixed big, questioning eyes upon Wade, which he found hard to endure. Again he tried to flash her a message of reassurance, but Columbine did not lose her look of blank wonder and gravity. "Ben, oh, you're not going to leave White Slides?" she asked. "Reckon I'll hang around yet a while," he replied. Belllounds was wagging his head regretfully and ponderingly. "Well, I remember the day when no man quit me. Well, times change. I'm an old man now. Mebbe I'm testy. And then there's that boy." With a shrug of his broad shoulders, he dismissed what seemed an encroachment of pessimistic thought. "Wade, you're packing off then on the trail. Always on the go, eh?" "No, I'm not hurrying off," replied Wade. "Well, might I ask what you're figuring on?" "Sure. I'm considering a cattle deal with Moore. He's a pretty keen boy, and his father has big ranchin' interests. I've saved a little money, and I'm no spring chicken any more. Wills has begun to buy and sell stock, so I reckon I'll go in with him." "Ahuh!" Belllounds gave a grunt of comprehension. He frowned, and his big eyes set seriously upon the blazing fire. He grasped complications in this information. "Well, it's a free country," he said at length, and evidently his personal anxieties were subjected to his sense of justice. "Owing to the peculiar circumstances here at my range, I'd prefer that Moore and you began somewhere else. That's natural. But you've my good will to start on, and I hope I've yours." "Belllounds, you've every man's good will," replied Wade. "I hope you won't take offense at my leaving. You see, I'm on Wils Moore's side in what you called these peculiar circumstances. He's got nobody else. And I reckon you can look back and remember how you've taken sides with some poor devil and stuck to him. Can't you?" "Well, I reckon I can. And I'm not thinking less of you for speaking out like that." "All right. Now about the dogs. I turned the pack over to you, and it's a good one. I'd like to buy Fox." "Buy nothin', man. You can have Fox and welcome." "Much obliged," returned the hunter as he turned to go. "Fox will sure be help for me. Belllounds, I'm going to round up this outfit that's rustlin' your cattle. They're getting sort of bold." "Wade, you'll do that on your own hook?" asked the rancher in surprise. "Sure. I like huntin' men more than other varmints. Then I've a personal interest. You know the hint about homesteaders hereabouts reflects some on Will's Moor." "Stuff!" exploded the rancher heartily. "Do you think any cattleman in these hills would believe Will's Moor a rustler?" "The hunch has been whispered," said Wade. "And you know how all ranchers say they rustled a little on the start?" "Oh, hell, that's different. Every new rancher drives in a few unbranded calves and keeps them. But stealin' stock, that's different. An' I'd as soon suspect my own son of rustlin' as Will's Moor." Belllounds spoke with a sincere and frank ardor of defense for a young man once employed by him and known to be honest. The significance of the comparison he used had not struck him. His was the epitome of a successful rancher, sure in his opinions, speaking proudly and unreflectingly of his own son, and being just to another man. Wade bowed and backed out of the door. "Sure, that's what I'd reckon you'd say, Belllounds. I'll drop in on you if I find any sign in the woods. Good night." Columbine went with him to the end of the porch, as she had used to go before the shadow had settled over the lives of the Belllounds. "Ben, you're up to something," she whispered, seizing him with hands that shook. "Sure, but don't you worry," he whispered back. "Do they hint that Wilson is a rustler?" she asked intensely. "Somebody did, Collie." "How vile! Who? Who?" she demanded, and her face gleamed white. "Hush, lass, you're all a tremble," he returned warily, and he held her hands. "Ben, they're pressing me hard to set another wedding day. Dad is angry with me now. Jack has begun again to demand. Oh, I'm afraid of him. He has no respect for me. He catches at me with hands like claws. I have to jerk away. Oh, Ben, Ben, dear friend, what on earth shall I do?" "Don't give in. Fight Jack. Tell the old man you must have time. Watch your chance when Jack is away, and ride up the Buffalo Park trail and look for me." Wade had to release his hands from her clasp and urge her gently back. How pale and tragic her face gleamed. Wade took his horses, his outfit, and the dog Fox, and made his abode with Wilson Moore. The cowboy hailed Wade's coming with joy and pestered him with endless questions. From that day Wade haunted the hills above White Slides, early and late, alone with his thoughts, his plans, more and more feeling the suspense of happenings to come. It was on a June day when Jack Belllounds rode to Kremmling that Wade met Columbine on the Buffalo Park trail. She needed to see him, to find comfort and strength. Wade far exceeded his own confidence in his effort to uphold her. Columbine was in a strange state, not of vacillation between two courses, but of a standstill, as if her will had become obstructed and waited for some force to upset the hindrance. She did not inquire as to the welfare of Wilson Moore, and Wade vouchsafed no word of him. But she importuned the hunter to see her every day or no more at all, and Wade answered her appeal and her need by assuring her that he would see her come what might, so she was to risk more frequent rides. During the second week of June, Wade rode up to visit the prospector, Lewis, and learned that which complicated the matter of the rustlers. Lewis had been suspicious and active on his own account. According to the best of his evidence and judgment, there had been a gang of rough men come of late to Gore Peak, where they presumably were prospecting. This gang was composed of strangers to Lewis. They had ridden to his cabin, bought and borrowed of him, and during his absence had stolen from him. He believed they were in hiding, probably being guilty of some depredation in another locality. They gave both Kremmling and Elgeria a wide berth. On the other hand, the Smith gang from Elgeria rode to and fro, like ranchers searching for lost horses. There were only 3 in this gang, including Smith. Lewis had seen these men driving unbranded stock. And lastly, Lewis casually imparted the information, highly interesting to Wade, that he had seen Jack Belllounds riding through the forest. The prospector did not in the least, however, connect the appearance of the son of Belllounds with the other facts so peculiarly interesting to Wade. Cowboys and hunters rode trails across the range, and though they did so rather infrequently, there was nothing unusual about encountering them. Wade remained all night with Lewis, and next morning rode 6 miles along the divide and then down into a valley, where at length he found a cabin described by the prospector. It was well hidden in the edge of the forest, where a spring gushed from under a low cliff. But for water and horse tracks, Wade would not have found it easily. Rifle in hand and on foot, he slipped around in the woods as a hunter might have, to stalk drinking deer. There were no smoke, no noise, no horses anywhere round the cabin, and after watching a while, Wade went forward to look at it. It was an old ramshackle hunter's or prospector's cabin, with dirt floor, a crumbling fireplace and chimney, and a bed platform made of boughs. Including the door, it had 3 apertures, and the 2 smaller ones, serving as windows, looked as if they had been intended for portholes as well. The inside of the cabin was large and unusually well lighted, owing to the windows and to the open chinks between the logs. Wade saw a deck of cards lying bent and scattered in one corner, as if a violent hand had flung them against the wall. Strange that Wade's memory returned a vivid picture of Jack Belllounds in just that act of violence. The only other thing around the place which earned scrutiny from Wade was a number of horseshoe tracks outside, with the left front shoe track familiar to him. He examined the clearest imprints very carefully. If they had not been put there by Wilson Moore's white mustang, Spotty, then they had been made by a horse with a strangely similar hoof and shoe. Spotty had a hoof malformed, somewhat in the shape of a triangle, and the iron shoe to fit it always had to be bent, so that the curve was sharp and the ends closer together than those of his other shoes. Wade rode down to White Slides that day, and at the evening meal he casually asked Moore if he had been riding Spotty of late. "Sure. What other horse could I ride? Do you think I'm up to trying one of those broncs?" asked Moore in derision. "Reckon you haven't been leavin' any tracks up Buffalo Park way?" The cowboy slammed down his knife. "Say, Wade, are you growing dotty? Good Lord, if I'd ridden that far, if I was able to do it, wouldn't you hear me yell?" "Reckon so, come to think of it. I just saw a track like Spotty's made 2 days ago." "Well, it wasn't his, you can gamble on that," returned the cowboy. Wade spent 4 days hiding in an aspen grove, on top of one of the highest foothills above White Slides Ranch. There he lay at ease, like an Indian, calm and somber, watching the trails below, waiting for what he knew was to come. On the 5th morning he was at his post at sunrise. A casual remark of one of the new cowboys the night before accounted for the early hour of Wade's reconnoiter. The dawn was fresh and cool, with sweet odor of sage on the air. The jays were squalling their annoyance at this early disturber of their grove. The east was rosy above the black range, and soon glowed with gold, and then changed to fire. The sun had risen. All the mountain world of black range and gray hill and green valley, with its shining stream, was transformed as if by magic color. Wade sat down with his back to an aspen tree, his gaze down upon the ranch house and the corrals. A lazy column of blue smoke curled up toward the sky, to be lost there. The burros were braying, the calves were bawling, the colts were whistling. One of the hounds bayed full and clear. The scene was pastoral and beautiful. Wade saw it clearly and whole. Peace and plenty, a happy rancher's home, the joy of the dawn and the birth of summer, the rewards of toil, all seemed significant there. But Wade pondered on how pregnant with life that scene was, nature in its simplicity and freedom and hidden cruelty, and the existence of people blindly hating, loving, sacrificing, mostly serving some noble aim, and yet with baseness among them, the lees with the wine, evil intermixed with good. By and by the cowboys appeared on their spring mustangs, and in twos and threes they rode off in different directions. But none rode Wade's way. The sun rose higher and there was warmth in the air. Bees began to hum by Wade, and fluttering moths winged uncertain flight over him. At the end of another hour Jack Belllounds came out of the house, gazed around him, and then stalked to the barn where he kept his horses. For a little while he was not in sight. Then he reappeared, mounted on a white horse, and he rode into the pasture, and across that to the hayfield, and along the edge of this to the slope of the hill. Here he climbed to a small clump of aspens. This grove was not so far from Wilson Moore's cabin. In fact, it marked the boundary line between the rancher's range and the acres that Moore had acquired. Jack vanished from sight here, but not before Wade had made sure he was dismounting. "Reckon he kept to that grassy ground for a reason of his own, and plainer to me than any tracks," soliloquized Wade as he strained his eyes. At length Belllounds came out of the grove and led his horse round to where Wade knew there was a trail leading to and from Moore's cabin. At this point Jack mounted and rode west. Contrary to his usual custom, which was to ride hard and fast, he trotted the white horse as a cowboy might have done when going out on a day's work. Wade had to change his position to watch Belllounds, and his somber gaze followed him across the hill, down the slope, along the willow-bordered brook, and so on to the opposite side of the great valley, where Jack began to climb in the direction of Buffalo Park. After Belllounds had disappeared and had been gone for an hour, Wade went down on the other side of the hill, found his horse where he had left him in a thicket, and mounting, he rode around to strike the trail upon which Belllounds had ridden. The imprint of fresh horse tracks showed clear in the soft dust, and the left front track had been made by a shoe crudely triangular in shape, identical with that peculiar to Wilson Moore's horse. "Aha!" muttered Wade, in greeting to what he had expected to see. "Well, Buster Jack, it's a plain trail now. Damn your crooked soul." The hunter took up that trail, and he followed it into the woods. There he hesitated. Men who left crooked trails frequently ambushed them, and Belllounds had made no effort to conceal his tracks. Indeed, he had chosen the soft, open ground even after he had left the trail to take to the grassy wooded benches. There were cattle here, but not as many as on the more open aspen slopes across the valley. After deliberating a moment, Wade decided that he must risk being caught trailing Belllounds, but he would go slowly, trusting to eye and ear to outwit this strangely acting foreman of White Slides Ranch. To that end he dismounted and took the trail. Wade had not followed it far before he became convinced that Belllounds had been looking in the thickets for cattle, and he had not climbed another mile through the aspens and spruce before he discovered that Belllounds was driving cattle. Thereafter Wade proceeded more cautiously. If the long grass had not been wet, he would have encountered great difficulty in trailing Belllounds. Evidence was clear now that he was hiding the tracks of the cattle by keeping to the grassy levels and slopes, which, after the sun had dried them, would not leave a trace. There were stretches where even the keen-eyed hunter had to work to find the direction taken by Belllounds. But here and there in other localities there showed faint signs of cattle and horse tracks. The morning passed with Wade slowly climbing to the edge of the black timber. Then, in a hollow where a spring gushed forth, he saw the tracks of a few cattle that had halted to drink, and on top of these the tracks of a horse with a crooked left front shoe. The rider of this horse had dismounted. There was an imprint of a cowboy's boot, and near it little sharp circles with dots in the center. "Well, I'll be damned!" ejaculated Wade. "I call that mighty cunnin'. Here they are, proofs as plain as writin' that Wils Moore rustled Old Bill's cattle. Buster Jack, you're not such a fool as I thought. He's made somethin' like the end of Wil's crutch, and knowin' how Wils uses that every time he gets off his horse, why, the dirty pup carried his instrument with him and made these tracks." Wade left the trail then, and leading his horse to a covert of spruce, he sat down to rest and think. Was there any reason for following Belllounds farther? It did not seem needful to take the risk of being discovered. The forest above was open. No doubt Belllounds would drive the cattle somewhere and turn them over to his accomplices. "Buster Jack's outbusted himself this time, sure," soliloquized Wade. "He's double-crossin' his rustler friends, same as he is Moore. For he's going to blame this cattle stealin' onto Wils. And to do that he's layin' his tracks so he can follow them, or so any good trailer can. It doesn't concern me so much now who are his pards in this deal. Reckon it's Smith and some of his gang." Suddenly it dawned upon Wade that Jack Belllounds was stealing cattle from his father. "Whew!" he whistled softly. "Awful hard on the old man. Who's to tell him when all this comes out? Oh, I'd hate to do it. I wouldn't. There's some things even I'd not tell." Straightway this strange aspect of the case confronted Wade and gripped his soul. He seemed to feel himself changing inwardly, as if a gray, gloomy, sodden hand, as intangible as a ghostly dream, had taken him bodily from himself and was now leading him into shadows, into drear, lonely, dark solitude where all was cold and bleak, and on over naked shingles that marked the world of tragedy. Here he must tell his tale, and as he plodded on, his relentless leader forced him to tell his tale anew. Wade recognized this as his black mood. It was a morbid dominance of the mind. He fought it as he would have fought a devil, and mastery still was his. But his brow was clammy, and his heart was leaden when he had wrested that somber, mystic control from his will. "Reckon I'd do well to take up this trail to-morrow and see where it leads," he said. And as a gloomy man, burdened with thought, he retraced his way down the long slope and over the benches to the grassy slopes and aspen groves, and thus to the sage hills. It was dark when he reached the cabin, and Moore had supper almost ready. "Well, old-timer, you look fagged out," called out the cowboy cheerily. "Throw off your boots, wash up, and come and get it." "Pard, Wils, I'm not reboundin' as natural as I'd like. I reckon I've lived some years before I got here, and a lifetime since." "Wade, you have a queer look lately," observed Moore, shaking his head solemnly. "Why, I've seen a dying man look just like you, now, round the mouth, but most in the eyes." "Maybe the end of the long trail is White Slides Ranch," replied Wade, sadly and dreamily, as if to himself. "If Collie heard you say that!" exclaimed Moore in anxious concern. "Collie and you will hear me say a lot before long," returned Wade. "But as it's calculated to make you happy, why, all's well. I'm tired and hungry." Wade did not choose to sit round the fire that night, fearing to invite interrogation from his anxious friend, and for that matter from his other inquisitively morbid self. Next morning, though Wade felt rested and the sky was blue and full of fleecy clouds, and the melody of birds charmed his ear, and over all the June air seemed thick and beating with the invisible spirit he loved, he sensed the oppression, the nameless something that presaged catastrophe. Therefore, when he looked out of the door to see Columbine swiftly riding up the trail, her fair hair flying and shining in the sunlight, he merely ejaculated, "Uh-huh." "What's that?" queried Moore, sharp to catch the inflection. "Look out," replied Wade, as he began to fill his pipe. "Heavens! It's Collie! Look at her riding! Uphill, too!" Wade followed him outdoors. Columbine was not long in arriving at the cabin, and she threw the bridle and swung off in the same motion, landing with a light thud. Then she faced them, pale, resolute, stern, all the sweetness gone to bitter strength. Another and a strange Columbine. "I've not slept a wink," she said, "and I came as soon as I could get away." Moore had no word for her, not even a greeting. The look of her had stricken him. It could have only one meaning. "Mornin', lass," said the hunter, and he took her hand. "I couldn't tell you looked sleepy, for all you said. Let's go into the cabin." So he led Columbine in, and Moore followed. The girl manifestly was in a high state of agitation, but she was neither trembling, nor frightened, nor sorrowful, nor did she betray any lack of an unflinching and indomitable spirit. Wade read the truth of what she imagined was her doom in the white glow of her, in the matured lines of womanhood that had come since yesternight, in the sustained passion of her look. "Ben! Wilson! The worst has come," she announced. Moore could not speak. Wade held Columbine's hand in both of his. "Worst? Now, Collie, that's a terrible word. I've heard it many times, and all my life the worst's been comin', and it hasn't come yet. You, only 20 years old, talkin' wild. The worst has come. Tell me your trouble now, and I'll tell you where you're wrong." "Jack's a thief, a cattle thief," rang Columbine's voice, high and clear. "Uh-huh. Well, go on," said Wade. "Jack has taken money from rustlers for cattle stolen from his father." Wade felt the lift of her passion, and he vibrated to it. "Reckon that's no news to me," he replied. Then she quivered up to a strong and passionate delivery of the thing that had transformed her. "I'm going to marry Jack Belllounds." Wilson Moore leaped toward her with a cry, to be held back by Wade's hand. "Now, Collie," he soothed, "tell us all about it." Columbine, still upheld by the strength of her spirit, related how she had ridden out the day before, early in the afternoon, in the hope of meeting Wade. She rode over the sage hills, along the edges of the aspen benches, everywhere that she might expect to meet or see the hunter, but as he did not appear, and as she was greatly desirous of talking with him, she went on up into the woods, following the line of the Buffalo Park trail, though keeping aside from it. She rode very slowly and cautiously, remembering Wade's instructions. In this way she ascended the aspen benches and the spruce-bordered ridges, and then the first rise of the Black Forest. Finally she had gone farther than ever before, and farther than was wise. When she was about to turn back, she heard the thud of hoofs ahead of her. Pronto shot up his ears. Alarmed and anxious, Columbine swiftly gazed about her. It would not do for her to be seen. Yet, on the other hand, the chances were that the approaching horse carried Wade. It was lucky that she was on Pronto, for he could be trusted to stand still and not neigh. Columbine rode into a thick clump of spruces that had long shelving branches reaching down. Here she hid, holding Pronto motionless. Presently the sound of hoofs denoted the approach of several horses. That augmented Columbine's anxiety. Peering out of her covert, she espied 3 horsemen trotting along the trail, and one of them was Jack Belllounds. They appeared to be in strong argument, judging from gestures and emphatic movements of their heads. As chance would have it, they halted their horses not half a dozen rods from Columbine's place of concealment. The 2 men with Belllounds were rough-looking, one of them, evidently a leader, having a dark face disfigured by a horrible scar. Naturally, they did not talk loud, and Columbine had to strain her ears to catch anything. But a word distinguished here and there, and accompanying actions, made transparent the meaning of their presence and argument. The big man refused to ride any farther. Evidently he had come so far without realizing it. His importunities were for more head of stock. His scorn was for a measly little bunch not worth the risk. His anger was for Belllounds' foolhardiness in leaving a trail. Belllounds had little to say, and most of that was spoken in a tone too low to be heard. His manner seemed indifferent, even reckless. But he wanted money. The scar-faced man's name was Smith. Then Columbine gathered from Smith's dogged and forceful gestures, and his words, "no money" and "bigger bunch," that he was unwilling to pay what had been agreed upon, unless Belllounds promised to bring a larger number of cattle. Here Belllounds roundly cursed the rustler, and apparently argued that course next to impossible. Smith made a sweeping movement with his arm, pointing south, indicating some place afar, and part of his speech was Gore Peak. The little man, companion of Smith, got into the argument, and dismounting from his horse, he made marks upon the smooth earth of the trail. He was drawing a rude map showing direction and locality. At length, when Belllounds nodded as if convinced or now informed, this 3rd member of the party remounted and seemed to have no more to say. Belllounds pondered sullenly. He snatched a switch from off a bough overhead and flicked his boot and stirrup with it, an action that made his horse restive. Smith leered and spoke derisively, of which speech Columbine heard "Aw, hell!" and "Yellow Streak!" and "No one 'd ever!" and "Son of Bill Belllounds!" and "rustlin' stock." Then this scar-faced man drew out a buckskin bag. Either the contempt or the gold, or both, overbalanced vacillation in the weak mind of Jack Belllounds, for he lifted his head, showing his face pale and malignant, and without trace of shame or compunction he snatched the bag of gold, shouted a hoarse "All right, damn you!" and wheeling the white mustang, he spurred away, quickly disappearing. The rustlers sat their horses, gazing down the trail, and Smith wagged his dark head doubtfully. Then he spoke quite distinctly. "I ain't a trustin' that Belllounds pup." And his comrade replied, "Boss, we ain't stealin' the stock, so what the hell?" Then they turned their horses and trotted out of sight and hearing up the timbered slope. Columbine was so stunned and so frightened and horrified that she remained hidden there for a long time before she ventured forth. Then, heading homeward, she skirted the trail and kept to the edge of the forest, making a wide detour over the hills, finally reaching the ranch at sunset. Jack did not appear at the evening meal. His father had one of his spells of depression and seemed not to have noticed her absence. She lay awake all night, thinking and praying. Columbine concluded her narrative there, and, panting from her agitation and hurry, she gazed at the bowed figure of Moore and then at Wade. "I had to tell you this shameful secret," she began again. "I'm forced. If you do not help me, if something is not done, there'll be a horrible end to all." "We'll help you, but how?" asked Moore, raising a white face. "I don't know yet. I only feel what may happen if I don't prevent it. Wilson, you must go home, at least for a while." "It'll not look right for Wils to leave White Slides now," interposed Wade, positively. "But why? "Oh, I fear—" "Never mind now, lass. It's a good reason, and you mustn't fear anything. I agree with you. We've got to prevent this that's going to happen." "Oh, Ben, my dear friend, we must prevent it. You must." So I was figuring. "Ben, you must go to Jack and tell him. Show him the peril, frighten him terribly, so that he will not do this shameful thing again." "Lass, I reckon I could scare Jack out of his skin, but what good would that do?" "It'll stop this madness. Then I'll marry him and keep him safe after that." "Collie, do you think marrying Buster Jack will stop his busting out?" "Oh, I know it will. He had conquered over the evil in him. I saw that. I felt it. He conquered over his baser nature for love of me. Then, when he heard from my own lips that I loved Wilson, why, then he fell. He didn't care. He drank again. He let go. He sank. And now he'll ruin us all. Oh, it looks as if he meant it that way. But I can change him. I will marry him. I will love him. Or I will live a lie. I will make him think I love him." Wilson Moore, deadly pale, faced her with flaming eyes. "Collie, why, for God's sake, explain why you will shame your womanhood and ruin me, all for that coward, that thief." Columbine broke from Wade and ran to Wilson, as if to clasp him. But something halted her and she stood before him. "Because Dad will kill him!" she cried. "My God, what are you saying?" exclaimed Moore incredulously. "Old Bill would roar and rage, but hurt that boy of his? Never!" "Wills, I reckon Collie is right. You haven't got Old Bill figured." "I know," interposed Wade with one of his forceful gestures. "Wilson, listen and don't set your heart against me, for I must do this thing," pleaded Columbine. "I heard Dad swear he'd kill Jack. Oh, I'll never forget. He was terrible. If he ever finds out that Jack stole from his own father, stole cattle like a common rustler, and sold them for gold to gamble and drink with, he will kill him. That's as true as fate. Think how horrible that would be for me, because I'm to blame here, mostly. I fell in love with you, Wilson Moore. Otherwise I could have saved Jack already. But it's not that I think of myself. Dad has loved me. He has been as a father to me. You know he's not my real father. Oh, if I only had a real one! And I owe him so much. But then it's not because I owe him or because I love him. It's because of his own soul. That splendid, noble old man who has been so good to everyone, who had only one fault, and that love of his son. Must he be let go in blinded and insane rage at the failure of his life, the ruin of his son? Must he be allowed to kill his own flesh and blood? It would be murder. It would damn Dad's soul to everlasting torment. No, no, I'll not let that be." "Collie, how about your own soul?" whispered Moore, lifting himself as if about to expend a tremendous breath. "That doesn't matter," she replied. "Collie, Collie!" he stammered, but could not go on. Then it seemed to Wade that they both turned to him, unconscious of the inevitableness of his relation to this catastrophe, yet looking to him for the spirit, the guidance that became habitual to them. It brought the warm blood back to Wade's cold heart. It was his great reward. How intensely and implacably did his soul mount to that crisis. "Collie, I'll never fail you," he said, and his gentle voice was deep and full. "If Jack can be scared into haltin' in his mad ride to hell, then I'll do it. I'm not promisin' so much for him. But I'll swear to you that old Belllounds's hands will never be stained with his son's blood." "Oh, Ben, Ben!" she cried in passionate gratitude. "I'll love you, bless you all my life." "Hush, lass, I'm not one to bless. And now you must do as I say. Go home and tell them you'll marry Jack in August. Say August 13th. "So long? Oh, why put it off? Wouldn't it be better, safer to settle it all once and forever?" "No man can tell everything, but that's my judgment." "Why August 13th?" she queried with strange curiosity. "An unlucky date." "Well, it just happened to come to my mind, that date," replied Wade in his slow, soft voice of reminiscence. "I was married on August 13th, 21 years ago. And, Collie, my wife looked something like you. Isn't that strange now? It's a little world. And she's been gone 18 years." "Ben, I never dreamed you ever had a wife," said Columbine softly, with her hands going to his shoulder. "You must tell me of her some day. But now, if you want time, if you think it best, I'll not marry Jack till August 13th." "That'll give me time," replied Wade. "I'm thinkin' Jack ought to be reformed, let's call it, before you marry him. If all you say is true, why, we can turn him round. Your promise will do most. So then, it's settled?" "Yes, dear friends," faltered the girl tremulously, on the verge of a breakdown, now that the ordeal was past. Wilson Moore stood gazing out of the door, his eyes far away on the gray slopes. "Queer how things turn out," he said dreamily. "August 13th. That's about the time the columbines blow on the hills. And I always meant Columbine time." Here he sharply interrupted himself, and the dreamy musing gave way to passion. "But I mean it yet. I'll die before I give up hope of you." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wade, watching Columbine ride down the slope on her homeward way, did some of the hardest thinking he had yet been called upon to do. It was not necessary to acquaint Wilson Moore with the deeper and more subtle motives that had begun to actuate him. It would not utterly break the cowboy's spirit to live in suspense. Columbine was safe for the present. He had insured her against fatality. Time was all he needed. Possibility of an actual consummation of her marriage to Jack Belllounds did not lodge for an instant in Wade's consciousness. In Moore's case, however, the present moment seemed critical. What should he tell Moore? What should he conceal from him? "Son, come in here," he called to the cowboy. "Pard, it looks bad," said Moore brokenly. Wade looked at the tragic face and cursed under his breath. "Buck up. It's never as bad as it looks. Anyway, we know now what to expect, and that's well." Moore shook his head. "Couldn't you see how like steel Collie was? But I'm on to you, Wade. You think by persuading Collie to put that marriage off that we'll gain time. You're gambling with time. You swear Buster Jack will hang himself. You won't quit fighting this deal. Buster Jack has slung the noose over a tree, and he's about ready to slip his head into it," replied Wade. "Pah, you drive me wild!" cried Moore passionately. "How can you? Where's all that feeling you seem to have for me? You nursed me. You saved my leg and my life. You must have cared about me. But now you talk about that dolt, that spoiled old man's pet, that damned cur, as if you believed he'd ruin himself. No such luck. no such hope. Every day things grow worse, yet the worse they grow, the stronger you seem. It's all out of proportion. It's dreams. Wade, I hate to say it, but I'm sure you're not always just right in your mind." "Wills, now ain't that queer?" replied Wade, sadly. "I'm agreein' with you." "Oh!" Moore shook himself savagely and laid an affectionate and appealing arm on his friend's shoulder. "Forgive me, pard. It's me who's out of his head. But my heart's broken." "That's what you think," rejoined Wade, stoutly. "But a man's heart can't break in a day. I know. And the God's truth is, Buster Jack will hang himself." Moore raised his head sharply, flinging himself back from his friend so as to scrutinize his face. Wade felt the piercing power of that gaze. "Wade, what do you mean?" "Collie told us some interestin' news about Jack, didn't she? Well, she didn't know what I know. Jack Belllounds had laid a cunnin' and devilish trap to prove you guilty of rustlin' his father's cattle." "Absurd!" ejaculated Moore, with white lips. "I'd never given him credit for brains to hatch such a plot," went on Wade. "Now listen. Not long ago Buster Jack made a remark in front of the whole outfit, includin' his father, that the homesteaders on the range were rustlin' cattle. It fell sort of flat, that remark. But no one could calculate on his infernal cunnin'. I quit workin' for Belllounds that night, an' I've put my time in spyin' on the boy. In my day I've done a good deal of spyin', but I've never run across anyone slicker than Buster Jack. To cut it short, he got himself a white speckled mustang that's a dead ringer for Spotty. He measured the tracks of your horse's left front foot, the bad hoof, you know, and he made a shoe exactly the same as Spotty wears. Also he made some kind of a contraption that's like the end of your crutch. These he packs with him. I saw him ride across the pasture to hide his tracks, climb up the sage for the same reason, and then hide in that grove of aspens over there near the trail you use. Here you can bet he changed shoes on the left front foot of his horse. Then he took to the trail, and he left tracks for a while, and then he was careful to hide them again. He stole his father's stock and drove it up over the grassy benches where even you or I couldn't track him next day. But up on top, when it suited him, he left some horse tracks, and in the mud near a spring hole he gets off his horse, steppin' with one foot, and makin' little circles with dots like those made by the end of your crutch. Then, way over in the woods, there's a cabin where he meets his accomplices. Here he leaves the same horse tracks and crutch tracks. Simple as ABC, Wills, when you see how he did it. But I'll tell you straight, if I hadn't been suspicious of Buster Jack, that trick of his would have made you a rustler." "Damn him!" hissed the cowboy, in utter consternation and fury. "Ahuh, that's my sentiment exactly." "I swore to Collie I'd never kill him." "Sure you did, son, and you've got to keep that oath. I pin you down to it. You can't break faith with Collie, and you don't want his bad blood on your hands." "No, no," he replied, violently. "Of course I don't. I won't. But God, how sweet it would be to tear out his lying tongue, to..." "I reckon it would. Only don't talk about that," interrupted Wade, bluntly. "You see now, don't you, how he's about hanged himself?" "No, pard, I don't. We can't squeal that on him, any more than we can squeal what Collie told us." "Son, you're young in dealin' with crooked men. You don't get the drift of motives. Buster Jack is not only robbin' his father an' hatchin' a dirty trap for you, but he's double crossin' the rustlers he's sellin' the cattle to. He's riskin' their necks. He's goin' to find your tracks, showin' you dealt with them. Sure he won't give them away, an' he's figurin' on their gettin' out of it, Maybe by leaving the range or a shooting fray or some way. The big thing with Jack is that he's going to accuse you of rustling and show your tracks to his father. Well, that's a risk he's given the rustlers. It happens that I know this Scarface Smith. We've met before. Now, it's easy to see from what Collie heard that Smith is not trusting Buster Jack. So all underneath this Jack Belllounds game, there's forces working unbeknown to him, beyond his control, and sure to ruin him. I see, by heaven. Wade, nothing else but ruin seems possible. But suppose it works out his way. What then? What of Collie? Son, I've not got that far along in my reckoning, replied Wade. But for my sake, think. If Buster Jack gets away with his trick, if he doesn't hang himself by some blunder or fit of temper or spree, what then of Collie? Wade could not answer this natural and inevitable query for the reason that he had found it impossible of consideration. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, he replied. Wade, you've said that before. It helped me. But now I need more than a few words from the Bible. My faith is low. I tried to pray because Collie told me she had prayed. But what are prayers? We're dealing with a stubborn, iron-willed old man who idolizes his son. We're dealing with a crazy boy, absolutely self-centered, crafty and vicious, who'll stop at nothing. And lastly, we're dealing with a girl who's so noble and high-souled that she'll sacrifice her all, her life, to pay her debt. If she were really Bill Belllounds' daughter, she'd never marry Jack, saying, of course, that he was not her brother. Do you know that it will kill her if she marries him? I reckon it would, replied Wade, with his head bowed. Moore roused his gloomy forebodings. He did not care to show this feeling or the effect the cowboy's pleading had upon him. Ah, so you admit it. Well then, what of Collie? If she marries him, she'll have to die, I suppose, replied Wade. Then Wilson Moore leaped at his friend and with ungentle hands lifted him, pushed him erect. Damn you, Wade! You're not square with me. You don't tell me all, he cried hoarsely. Now, Wills, you're set up. I've told you all I know. I swear that. But you couldn't stand the thought of Collie dying for that brute. You couldn't. Oh, I know. I can feel some things that are hard to tell. So you're either out of your head or you've something up your sleeve. It's hard to explain how you affect me. One minute I'm ready to choke you for that damned strangeness, whatever it is. The next minute I feel it. I trust it myself. Wade, you're not. You can't be infallible. I'm only a man, Wills, and your friend. I reckon you do find me queer, but that's no matter. Now, let's look at this deal, each from his own side of the fence, and each acting up to his own lights. You do what your conscience dictates, always thinking of Collie, not of yourself, and I'll live up to my principles. Can we do more? No, indeed, Wade, we can't, replied Moore eloquently. Well then, here's my hand. I've talked too much, I reckon, and the time for talking is past. In silence, Moore gripped the hand held out to him, trying to read Wade's mind, apparently once more uplifted and strengthened by that which he could not divine. Wade's observations during the following week brought forth the fact that Jack Belllounds was not letting any grass grow under his feet. He endeavored to fulfill his agreement with Smith and drove a number of cattle by moonlight. These were part of the stock that the rancher had sold to buyers at Kremmling, and which had been collected and held in the big fenced pasture down the valley next to the Andrews ranch. The loss was not discovered until the cattle had been counted at Kremmling. Then they were credited to loss by straying. In driving a considerable herd of half-wild steers with an inadequate force of cowboys, it was no unusual thing to lose a number. Wade, however, was in possession of the facts not later than the day after this midnight steal in the moonlight. He was forced to acknowledge that no one would have believed it possible for Jack Belllounds to perform a feat which might well have been difficult for the best of cowboys. But Jack accomplished it and got back home before daylight. And Wade was bound to admit that circumstantial evidence against Wilson Moore, which, of course, Jack Belllounds would soon present, would be damning and apparently irrefutable. Waiting for further developments, Wade closely watched the ranch house, which duty interfered with his attention to the outlying trails. What he did not want to miss was being present when Jack Belllounds accused Wilson Moore of rustling cattle. So it chanced that Wade was chatting with the cowboys one Sunday afternoon when Jack, accompanied by 3 strangers, all mounted on dusty, tired horses, rode up to the porch and dismounted. Lem Billings manifested unusual excitement. "Montana, ain't that Sheriff Burley from Kremmlin'?" he queried. "Sure looks like him. Yep, that's him. Now what's doin'?" The cowboys exchanged curious glances and then turned to Wade. "Bent, what do you make of that?" asked Lem as he waved his hand toward the house. "Buster Jack ridin' up with Sheriff Burley." The rancher, Belllounds, who was on the porch, greeted the visitors, and then they all went into the house. "Boys, it's what I've been looking for," replied Wade. "Sure. Reckon we all have ideas. An' if my idea is correct, I'm a-goin' to get pretty damn sore pronto," declared Lem. They were all silent for a few moments, meditating over this singular occurrence, and watching the house. Presently Old Bill Belllounds strode out upon the porch, and, walking out into the court, he peered around as if looking for someone. Then he espied the little group of cowboys. "Hey!" he yelled. "One of you boys ride up and fetch Wils Moore down here." "All right, boss," called Lem in reply, as he got up and gave a hitch to his belt. The rancher hurried back, head down as if burdened. "Wade, I reckon you want to go fetch Wils?" queried Lem. "If it's all the same to you, I'd rather not," replied Wade. "By golly, I don't blame you. Boys, sure in hell, Burley's after Wils." "Well, suppose he is," said Montana. "You can gamble Wils ain't a-goin' to run. I'd just like to see him face that outfit. Burley's a pretty square fellar, an' he's no fool." "It's as plain as your nose, Montana, an' that's sure big enough," returned Lem, with a hard light in his eyes. "Buster Jack's busted out, an' he's figured Wils in some deal that's rung in the sheriff. Well, I'll fetch Wils." And growling to himself, the cowboy slouched off after his horse. Wade got up, deliberate and thoughtful, and started away. "Say, Bent, you're sure going to see what's up?" asked Montana in surprise. "I'll be around, Jim," replied Wade, and he strolled off to be alone. He wanted to think over this startling procedure of Jack Belllounds. Wade was astonished. He had expected that an accusation would be made against Moore by Jack, and an exploitation of such proofs as had been craftily prepared. But he had never imagined Jack would be bold enough to carry matters so far. Sheriff Burley was a man of wide experience, keen, practical, shrewd. He was also one of the countless men Wade had rubbed elbows with in the eventful past. It had been Wade's idea that Jack would be satisfied to face his father with the accusation of Moore, and thus cover his tracks. Whatever old Belllounds might have felt over the loss of a few cattle, he would never have hounded and arrested a cowboy who had done well by him. Burley, however, was a sheriff, and a conscientious one, and he happened to be particularly set against rustlers. Here was a complication of circumstances. What would Jack Belllounds insist upon? How would Columbine take this plot against the honour and liberty of Wilson Moore? How would Moore himself react to it? Wade confessed that he was helpless to solve these queries, and there seemed to be a further one, insistent and gathering. What was to be his own attitude here? That could not be answered either, because only a future moment, over which he had no control, and which must decide events, held that secret. Worry beset Wade, but he still found himself proof against the insidious gloom ever hovering near like his shadow. He waited near the trail to intercept Billings and Moore on their way to the ranch house, and to his surprise they appeared sooner than it would have been reasonable to expect them. Wade stepped out of the willows and held up his hand. He did not see anything unusual in Moore's appearance. "Wills, I reckon we'd do well to talk this over," said Wade. "Talk what over?" queried the cowboy sharply. "Why, old Bill's sendin' for you, and the fact of Sheriff Burley bein' here." "Talk nothing. Let's see what they want, and then talk. Pard, you remember the agreement we made not long ago?" "Sure, but I'm sort of worried, and maybe—" "You needn't worry about me. Come on," interrupted Moore. "I'd like you to be there. And, Lem, fetch the boys." "I sure will, and if you need any backin', you'll get it." When they reached the open, Lem turned off toward the corrals, and Wade walked beside Moore's horse up to the house. Belllounds appeared at the door, evidently having heard the sound of hoofs. "Hello, Moore. Get down and come in," he said gruffly. "Belllounds, if it's all the same to you, I'll take mine in the open," replied the cowboy coolly. The rancher looked troubled. He did not have the ease and force habitual to him in big moments. "Come out here, you men," he called in the door. Voices, heavy footsteps, the clinking of spurs, preceded the appearance of the three strangers, followed by Jack Belllounds. The foremost was a tall man in black, sandy-haired and freckled, with clear gray eyes and a drooping mustache that did not hide stern lips and rugged chin. He wore a silver star on his vest, packed a gun in a greasy holster worn low down on his right side, and under his left arm he carried a package. It suited Wade, then, to step forward, and if he expected surprise and pleasure to break across the sheriff's stern face, he certainly had not reckoned in vain. "Well, I'm a son of a gun!" ejaculated Burley, bending low with quick movement to peer at Wade. "Howdy, Jim. How's tricks?" said Wade, extending his hand, and the smile that came so seldom illumined his sallow face. "Hell-bent Wade, as I'm a born sinner!" shouted the sheriff, and his hand leaped out to grasp Wade's and grip it and wring it. His face worked. "My God, I'm glad to see you, old-timer. Well, you haven't changed at all. 10 years! How time flies! And it's sure you." "Same, Jim, and powerful glad to meet you," replied Wade. "Shake hands with Bridges and Lindsay," said Burley, indicating his two comrades. "Stockmen from Grand Lake. Boys, you've heerd me talk about him. Wade and I was both in the old fight at Blair's ranch on the Gunnison, and I've sure reason to recollect him. Wade, what are you doing up in these diggin's?" "Drifted over last fall, Jim, and have been huntin' varmints for Belllounds," replied Wade. "Cleaned the range up fair to middlin'. And since I quit Belllounds, I've been hanging round with my young pard here, Wils Moore, and interestin' myself in lookin' up cattle tracks." Burley's back was toward Belllounds and his son, so it was impossible for them to see the sudden little curious light that gleamed in his eyes as he looked hard at Wade and then at Moore. "Wils Moore, how'd you do? I reckon I remember you, though I don't ride up this way much of late years." The cowboy returned the greeting civilly enough, but with brevity. Belllounds cleared his throat and stepped forward. His manner showed he had a distasteful business at hand. "Moore, I sent for you on a serious matter, I'm sorry to say." "Well, here I am. What is it?" returned the cowboy, with clear hazel eyes, full of fire, steady on the old rancher's. "Jack, you know, is foreman of White Slides now, and he's made a charge against you." "Then let him face me with it," snapped Moore. Jack Belllounds came forward, hands in his pockets, self-possessed, even a little swaggering, and his pale face and bold eyes showed the gravity of the situation and his mastery over it. Wade watched this meeting of the rivals and enemies with an attention powerfully stimulated by the penetrating scrutiny Burley laid upon them. Jack did not speak quickly. He looked hard into the tense face of Moore. Wade detected a vibration of Jack's frame and a gleam of eye that showed him not wholly in control of exultation and revenge. Fear had not struck him yet. "Well, Buster Jack, what's the charge?" demanded Moore, impatiently. The old name, sharply flung at Jack by this cowboy, seemed to sting and reveal and inflame. But he restrained himself as with roving glance he searched Moore's person for sight of a weapon. The cowboy was unarmed. "I accuse you of stealing my father's cattle," declared Jack in low, husky accents. After he got the speech out, he swallowed hard. Moore's face turned a dead white. For a fleeting instant a red and savage gleam flamed in his steady glance. Then it vanished. The cowboys who had come up moved restlessly. Lem Billings dropped his head, muttering. Montana Jim froze in his tracks. Moore's dark eyes, scornful and piercing, never moved from Jack's face. It seemed as if the cowboy would never speak again. "You call me thief? You?" at length he exclaimed. "Yes, I do," replied Belllounds, loudly. "Before this sheriff and your father, you accuse me of stealing cattle?" "Yes." "And you accuse me before this man who saved my life, who knows me, before Hell-Bent Wade?" demanded Moore, as he pointed to the hunter. Mention of Wade in that significant tone of passion and wonder was not without effect upon Jack Belllounds. "What in hell do I care for Wade?" he burst out with the old intolerance. "Yes, I accuse you. Thief, rustler, and for all I know your precious Hell-Bent Wade may be..." He was interrupted by Burley's quick and authoritative interference. "Here, young man, I'm allowin' for your natural feelin's," he said, dryly, "but I advise you to bite your tongue. I ain't acquainted with Mr. Moore, but I happen to know Wade. Do you savvy? Well, then, if you've any more to say to Moore, get it over." "I've had my say," replied Belllounds, sullenly. "On what grounds do you accuse me?" demanded Moore. "I trailed you. I've got my proofs." Burley stepped off the porch and carefully laid down his package. "Moore, will you get off your hoss?" he asked, and when the cowboy had dismounted and limped aside, the sheriff continued, "Is this the hoss you ride most?" "He's the only one I have." Burley sat down upon the edge of the porch, and carefully unwrapping the package, he disclosed some pieces of hard-baked yellow mud. The smaller ones bore the imprint of a circle with a dot in the center, very clearly defined. The larger piece bore the imperfect but reasonably clear track of a curiously shaped horseshoe, somewhat triangular. The sheriff placed these pieces upon the ground. Then he laid hold of Moore's crutch, which was carried like a rifle in a sheath hanging from the saddle, and drawing it forth, he carefully studied the round cap on the end. Next he inserted this end into both the little circles on the pieces of mud. They fitted perfectly. The cowboys bent over to get a closer view, and Billings was wagging his head. Old Belllounds had an earnest eye for them also. Burley's next move was to lift the left front foot of Moore's horse and expose the bottom to view. Evidently the white mustang did not like these proceedings, but he behaved himself. The iron shoe on this hoof was somewhat triangular in shape. When Burley held the larger piece of mud with its imprint close to the hoof, it was not possible to believe that this iron shoe had not made the triangular-shaped track. Burley let go of the hoof and laid the pieces of mud down. Slowly the other men straightened up. Someone breathed hard. "Moore, what do them tracks look like to you?" asked the sheriff. "They look like mine," replied the cowboy. "They are yours." "I'm not denying that." "I cut them pieces of mud from beside a water hole over here under Gore Peak. We'd trailed the cattle Belllounds lost, and then we kept on trailin' them, clear to the road that goes over the ridge to Elgeria. Now Bridges and Lindsay here bought stock lately from strange cattlemen who didn't give no clear idea of their range, just buying and selling, they claimed. I reckon the extra horse tracks we run across at Gore Peak connects up them buyers and sellers with whoever drove Belllounds' cattle up there. Have you anything more to say?" "No, not here," replied Moore quietly. "Then I'll have to arrest you and take you to Kremmlin' for trial." "All right, I'll go." The old rancher seemed genuinely shocked. Red tinged his cheek and a flame flared in his eyes. "Wils, you done me dirt," he said, wrathfully. "An' I always swore by you. Make a clean breast of the whole damn business if you want me to treat you white. You must have been locoed or drunk to double-cross me that way. Come on, out with it." "I've nothing to say," replied Moore. "You act amazin' strange for a cowboy I've knowed to lean toward fightin' at the drop of a hat. I tell you, speak out an' I'll do right by you. I ain't forgettin' that White Slides gave you a hard knock. An' I was young once an' had hot blood." The old rancher's wrathful pathos stirred the cowboy to a straining point of his unnatural, almost haughty composure. He seemed about to break into violent utterance. Grief and horror and anger seemed at the back of his trembling lips. The look he gave Belllounds was assuredly a strange one to come from a cowboy who was supposed to have stolen his former employer's cattle. Whatever he might have replied was cut off by the sudden appearance of Columbine. "Dad, I heard you," she cried as she swept upon them, fearful and wide-eyed. "What has Wilson Moore done that you'll do right by him?" "Collie, go back in the house," he ordered. "No. There's something wrong here," she said with mounting dread in the swift glance she shot from man to man. "Oh, you're Sheriff Burley!" she gasped. "I reckon I am, miss, and if young Moore's a friend of yours I'm sorry I came," replied Burley. Wade himself reacted subtly and thrillingly to the presence of the girl. She was alive, keen, strung, growing white with darkening eyes of blue fire, beginning to grasp intuitively the meaning here. "My friend? He was more than that, not long ago. What has he done? Why are you here?" "Miss, I'm arresting him." "Oh! For what?" "Rustlin' your father's cattle." For a moment Columbine was speechless. Then she burst out. "Oh, there's a terrible mistake." "Miss Columbine, I sure hope so," replied Burley, much embarrassed and distressed. Like most men of his kind, he could not bear to hurt a woman. "But it looks bad for Moore. See here. There, look at the tracks of his horse. Left front foot shoe all crooked. That's his horse's. He acknowledges that. And see here. Look at the little circles and dots. I found these way over at Gore Peak, with the tracks of the stolen cattle. And no other tracks, Miss Columbine." "Who put you on that trail?" she asked, piercingly. "Jack here. He found it first and rode to Kremmlin' for me." "Jack! Jack Belllounds!" she cried, bursting into wild and furious laughter. Like a tigress she leaped at Jack as if to tear him to pieces. "You put the sheriff on that trail. You accuse Wilson Moore of stealing Dad's cattle?" "Yes, and I proved it," replied Jack hoarsely. You proved it? So that's your revenge? But you're to reckon with me, Jack Belllounds. You villain! You devil! You..." Suddenly she shrank back with a strong shudder. She gasped. Her face grew ghastly white. "Oh, my God! Horrible! Unspeakable!" She covered her face with her hands, and every muscle of her seemed to contract until she was stiff. Then her hands shot out to Moore. "Wilson Moore, what have you to say to this sheriff, to Jack Belllounds, to me?" Moore bent upon her a gaze that must have pierced her soul, so like it was to a lightning flash of love and meaning and eloquence. "Collie, they've got the proof. I'll take my medicine. Your dad is good. He'll be easy on me." "You lie," she whispered. "And I will tell why you lie." Moore did not show the shame and guilt that should have been natural with his confession, but he showed an agony of distress. His hand sought Wade and dragged at him. It did not need this mute appeal to tell Wade that in another moment Columbine would have flung the shameful truth into the face of Jack Belllounds. She was rising to that. She was terrible and beautiful to see. "Collie," said Wade, with that voice he knew had strange power over her, with a clasp of her outflung hand. "No more. This is a man's game. It's not for a woman to judge. Not here. It's Wil's game, and it's mine. I'm his friend. Whatever his trouble or guilt, I take it on my shoulders. And it will be as if it were not." Moaning and wringing her hands, Columbine staggered with the burden of the struggle in her. "I'm quite mad or dreaming. Oh, Ben!" she cried. "Brace up, Collie. It's sure hard. Wil's your friend and playmate so many years. It's hard to believe. We all understand, Collie. Now you go in and don't listen to any more or look any more." He led her down the porch to the door of her room, and as he pushed it open he whispered, "I will save you, Collie, and Wil's, and the old man you call Dad." Then he returned to the silent group in the yard. "Jim, if I answer for Wil's Moore bein' in Kremmlin' the day you say, will you leave him with me?" "Well, I sure will, Wade," replied Burley, heartily. "I object to that," interposed Jack Belllounds, stridently. "He confessed. He's got to go to jail." "Well, my hot-tempered young fellar, there ain't any jail nearer'n Denver. Did you know that?" returned Burley, with his dry, grim humor. "Moore's under arrest, and he'll be as well off here with Wade as with me in Kremmlin', and a damn sight happier." The cowboy had mounted, and Wade walked beside him as he started homeward. They had not progressed far when Wade's keen ears caught the words, "Say, Belllounds, I got it figured that you an' your son don't savvy this fellar Wade." "Well, I reckon not," replied the old rancher. And his son let out a peal of laughter, bitter and scornful and unsatisfied. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gore Peak was the highest point of the Black Range that extended for miles westward from Buffalo Park. It was a rounded dome, covered with timber and visible as a landmark from the surrounding country. All along the eastern slope of that range, an unbroken forest of spruce and pine spread down to the edge of the valley. This valley narrowed toward its source, which was Buffalo Park. A few well-beaten trails crossed that country, one following Red Brook down to Kremmling, another crossing from the park to White Slides, and another going over the divide down to Algeria. The only well-known trail leading to Gore Peak was a branch off from the valley, and it went round to the south and more accessible side of the mountain. All that immense slope of timbered ridges, benches, ravines, and swales west of Buffalo Park was exceedingly wild and rough country. Here the buffalo took to cover from hunters and were safe until they ventured forth into the parks again. Elk and deer and bear made this forest their home. Bent Wade, hunter now for bigger game than wild beasts of the range, left his horse at Lewis's cabin and penetrated the dense forest alone, like a deer stalker or an Indian in his movements. Lewis had acted as scout for Wade and had ridden furiously down to Sage Valley with news of the rustlers. Wade had accompanied him back to Buffalo Park that night, riding in the dark. There were urgent reasons for speed. Jack Belllounds had ridden to Kremmling, and the hunter did not believe he would return by the road he had taken. Fox, Wade's favorite dog, much to his disgust, was left behind with Lewis. The bloodhound, Kane, accompanied Wade. Kane had been ill-treated and then beaten by Jack Belllounds, and he had left White Slides to take up his home at Moore's cabin. And at last he had seemed to reconcile himself to the hunter, not with love, but without distrust. Kane never forgave, but he recognized his friend and master. Wade carried his rifle and a buckskin pouch containing meat and bread. His belt, heavily studded with shells, contained 2 guns, both now worn in plain sight, with the one on the right side hanging low. Wade's character seemed to have undergone some remarkable change, yet what he represented then was not unfamiliar. He headed for the concealed cabin on the edge of the high valley, under the black brow of Gore Peak. It was early morning of a July day, with summer fresh and new to the forest. Along the park edges, the birds and squirrels were holding carnival. The grass was crisp and bediamonded with sparkling frost. Tracks of game showed sharp in the white patches. Wade paused once, listening. Ah, that most beautiful of forest melodies for him, the bugle of an elk. Clear, resonant, penetrating, with these qualities held and blended by a note of wildness, it rang thrillingly through all Wade's being. The hound listened, but was not interested. He kept close beside the hunter or at his heels, a stealthily stepping, warily glancing hound, not scenting the 4-footed denizens of the forest. He expected his master to put him on the trail of men. The distance from the park to Gore Peak, as a crow would have flown, was not great, but Wade progressed slowly. He kept to the dense parts of the forest. He avoided the open aisles, the swales, the glades, the high ridges, the rocky ground. When he came to the Algeria trail, he was not disappointed to find it smooth, untrodden by any recent travel. Half a mile farther on through the forest, however, he encountered tracks of 3 horses, made early the day before. Still farther on, he found cattle and horse tracks, now growing old and dim. These tracks, pointed toward Algeria, were like words of a printed page to Wade. About noon, he climbed a rocky eminence that jutted out from a slow descending ridge, and from this vantage point he saw down the wavering black and green bosom of the mountain slope. A narrow valley, almost hidden, gleamed yellow in the sunlight. At the edge of this valley a faint column of blue smoke curled upward. "Aha!" muttered the hunter as he looked. The hound whined and pushed a cool nose into Wade's hand. Then Wade resumed his noiseless and stealthy course through the woods. He began a descent, leading off somewhat to the right of the point where the smoke had arisen. The presence of the rustlers in the cabin was of importance, yet not so paramount as another possibility. He expected Jack Belllounds to be with them or meet them there, and that was the thing he wanted to ascertain. When he got down below the little valley, he swung around to the left, to cross the trail that came up from the main valley some miles still farther down. He found it and was not surprised to see fresh horse tracks made that morning. He recognized those tracks. Jack Belllounds was with the rustlers, come, no doubt, to receive his pay. Then the change in Wade and the actions of a trailer of men became more singularly manifest. He reverted to some former habit of mind and body. He was as slow as a shadow, absolutely silent, and the gaze that roved ahead and all around must have taken note of every living thing, of every moving leaf or fern or bough. The hound, with hair curling up stiff on his back, stayed close to Wade, watching, listening, and stepping with him. Certainly Wade expected the rustlers to have someone of their number doing duty as an outlook. So he kept uphill, above the cabin, and made his careful way through the thicket coverts, which at that place were dense and matted clumps of jack pine and spruce. At last he could see the cabin and the narrow grassy valley just beyond. To his relief, the horses were unsaddled and grazing. No man was in sight, but there might be a dog. The hunter, in his slow advance, used keen and unrelaxing vigilance, and at length he decided that if there had been a dog he would have been tied outside to give an alarm. Wade had now reached his objective point. He was some 80 paces from the cabin, in line with an open aisle, down which he could see into the cleared space before the door. On his left were thick, small spruces with low-spreading branches, and they extended all the way to the cabin on that side, and in fact screened 2 walls of it. Wade knew exactly what he was going to do. No longer did he hesitate. Laying down his rifle, he tied the hound to a little spruce, patting him and whispering for him to stay there and be still. Then Wade's action in looking to his belt guns was that of a man who expected to have recourse to them speedily, and by whom the necessity was neither regretted nor feared. Stooping low, he entered the thicket of spruces. The soft, spruce-matted ground, devoid of brush or twig, did not give forth the slightest sound of step, nor did the brushing of the branches against his body. In some cases he had to bend the boughs. Thus, swiftly and silently, with the gliding steps of an Indian, he approached the cabin till the brown-barked logs loomed before him, shutting off the clearer light. He smelled a mingling of wood and tobacco smoke. He heard low, deep voices of men, the shuffling and patting of cards, the musical click of gold. Resting on his knees a moment, the hunter deliberated. All was exactly as he had expected. Luck favored him. These gamblers would be absorbed in their game. The door of the cabin was just around the corner, and he could glide noiselessly to it, or gain it in a few leaps. Either method would serve. But which he must try depended upon the position of the men inside and that of their weapons. Rising silently, Wade stepped up to the wall and peeped through a chink between the logs. The sunshine streamed through windows and door. Jack Belllounds sat on the ground, full in its light, back to the wall. He was in his shirt sleeves. The gambling fever and the grievous soreness of a loser shone upon his pale face. Smith sat with back to Wade, opposite Belllounds. The other men completed the square. All were close enough together to reach comfortably for the cards and gold before them. Wade's keen eyes took this in at a single glance, and then steadied searchingly for smaller features of the scene. Belllounds had no weapon. Smith's belt and gun lay in the sunlight on the hard clay floor, out of reach except by violent effort. The other 2 rustlers both wore their weapons. Wade gave a long scrutiny to the faces of these comrades of Smith, and evidently satisfied himself as to what he had to expect from them. Wade hesitated. Then, stooping low, he softly swept aside the intervening boughs of spruce, glided out of the thicket into the open. 2 noiseless bounds, another, and he was inside the door. "Howdy, rustlers! Don't move!" he called. The surprise of his appearance, or his voice, or both, stunned the 4 men. Belllounds dropped his cards, and his jaw dropped at the same instant. These were absolutely the only visible movements. "I'm in talkin' humour, and the longer you listen, the longer you'll have to live," said Wade. "But don't move." "We ain't movin'," burst out Smith. "Who are you, and what do you want?" It was singular that the rustler leader had not had a look at Wade, whose movements had been swift and who now stood directly behind him. Also it was obvious that Smith was sitting very stiff-necked and straight. Not improbably he had encountered such situations before. "Who are you?" he shouted hoarsely. "You ought to know me." The voice was Wade's, gentle, cold, with depth and ring in it. "I've heard your voice somewheres, I'll gamble on that." "Sure, you ought to recognize my voice, Cap," returned Wade. The rustler gave a violent start, a start that he controlled instantly. "Cap! You callin' me that?" "Sure. We're old friends, Cap Folsom." In the silence then the rustler's hard breathing could be heard. His neck bulged red. Only the eyes of his 2 comrades moved. Belllounds began to recover somewhat from his consternation. Fear had clamped him also, but not fear of personal harm or peril. His mind had not yet awakened to that. "You've got me pat. But who are you?" said Folsom huskily. Wade kept silent. "Who in hell is that man?" yelled the rustler. It was not a query to his comrades any more than to the 4 winds. It was a furious questioning of a memory that stirred and haunted, and as well a passionate and fearful denial. "His name's Wade," put in Belllounds harshly. "He's the friend of Wils Moore. He's the hunter I told you about. Worked for my father last winter." "Wade? What? Wade? You never told me his name. It ain't... "Yes, it is, Cap," interrupted Wade. "It's the old boy that spoiled your handsome mug long ago." "Hell-bent Wade!" gasped Folsom in terrible accents. He shook all over. An ashen paleness crept into his face. Instinctively his right hand jerked toward his gun, then, as in his former motion, froze in the very act. "Careful, Cap," warned Wade. "It'd be a shame not to hear me talk a little. Turn around now and greet an old pard of the Gunnison days." Folsom turned as if a resistless, heavy force was revolving his head. "By Gawd! Wade!" he ejaculated. The tone of his voice, the light in his eyes, must have been a spiritual acceptance of a dreadful and irrefutable fact, perhaps the proximity of death. But he was no coward. Despite the hunter's order, given as he stood there, gun drawn and ready, Folsom wheeled back again, savagely, to throw the deck of cards in Belllounds's face. He cursed horribly. "You spoiled brat of a rich rancher! Why in hell didn't you tell me that varmint hunter was Wade?" "I did tell you," shouted Belllounds, flaming of face. "You're a liar! You never said Wade. Wade, right out so I'd hear it. And I'd never passed by Hell-Bent Wade. Oh, that name made me tired," replied Belllounds contemptuously. "Ha, ha, ha!" bawled the rustler. "Made you tired, hey? Think you're funny? Well, if you knowed how many men that name's made tired, and tired for keeps, you'd not think it so damn funny." "Say, what are you giving me? That Sheriff Burley tried to tell me and Dad a lot of rot about this Wade. Why, he's only a little bow-legged, big-nosed meddler, a man with a woman's voice, a sneaking cook and camp doctor and cow milker and God only knows what else." "Boy, you're correct. God only knows what else. It's the else you've got to learn, and I'll gamble you'll learn it. Wade, have you changed or grown old that you let a pup like this yap such talk?" "Well, Cap, he's very amusing just now, and I want you all to enjoy him. "Because, if you don't force my hand, I'm going to tell you some interesting stuff about this Buster Jack. Now, will you be quiet and listen and answer for your pards? Wade, I answer for no man. But, so far as I've noticed, my pards ain't hankering to make any loud noise," Folsom replied, indicating his comrades with sarcasm. The red-bearded one, a man of large frame and gaunt face, wicked and wild-looking, spoke out. "Say, Smith, or whatever the hell's your right handle, is this here a game we're playing?" "I reckon. And if you turn a trick you'll be damn lucky," growled Folsom. The other rustler did not speak. He was small, swarthy-faced, with sloe black eyes and matted hair, evidently a white man with Mexican blood. Keen, strung, furtive, he kept motionless, awaiting events. "Buster Jack, these new pards of yours are low-down rustlers, and one of them's worse, as I could prove," said Wade. "But compared with you, they're all gentlemen." Belllounds leered, but he was losing his bravado. Something began to dawn upon his obtuse consciousness. "What do I care for you or your gabby talk?" he flashed sullenly. "You'll care when I tell these rustlers how you double-crossed them." Belllounds made a spring, like that of a wolf in a trap, but when halfway up he slipped. The rustler on his right kicked him, and he sprawled down again, back to the wall. "Buster, look into this," called Wade, and he leveled the gun that quivered momentarily like a compass needle, and then crashed fire and smoke. The bullet spat into a log, but it had cut the lobe of Belllounds' ear, bringing blood. His face turned a ghastly, livid hue. All in a second terror possessed him, shuddering, primitive terror of death. Folsom haw-hawed derisively and in crude delight. "Say, Buster Jack, don't get any idea that my old pard Wade was shootin' at your head. Oh, no." The other rustlers understood then, if Belllounds had not, that the situation was in control of a man not in any sense ordinary. "Cap, did you know Buster Jack accused my friend, Wills Moore, of stealin' these cattle you're sellin'?" asked Wade deliberately. "What cattle did you say?" asked the rustler, as if he had not heard aright. "The cattle Buster Jack stole from his father and sold to you." "Wal, now, Bent Wade at his old tricks. I might have knowed it once I seen you. No, I'd no idea Belllounds blamed that stealin' onto any one." "He did." "Ahuh! Well, who's this Wills Moore?" "He's a cowboy, as fine a youngster as ever straddled a horse. Buster Jack hates him. He licked Jack a couple of times and won the love of a girl that Jack wants." "Ho, ho! Quite romantic, I declare. Say, there's some damn queer notions I'm getting about you, Buster Jack." Belllounds lay propped against the wall, sagging there, laboring of chest, sweating of face. The boldness of brow held because it was fixed, but that of his eyes had gone, and his mouth and chin showed craven weakness. He stared in dread suspense at Wade. "Listen, and all of you sit tight," went on Wade swiftly. "Jack stole the cattle from his father. He's a thief at heart. But he had a double motive. He left a trail. He left tracks behind. He made a crooked horseshoe like that Wills Moore's horse wears, and he put that on his own horse. And he made a contraption, a little iron ring with a dot in it, and he left the crooked shoe tracks, and he left the little ring tracks." "By Gawd, I seen them funny tracks," ejaculated Folsom. "At the water hole and right here in front of the cabin. I seen them. I knowed Jack made them somehow, but I didn't think. His white hoss has a crooked left front shoe." "Yes, he has, when Jack takes off the regular shoe and nails on the crooked one. Men, I followed those tracks. They lead up here to your cabin. Belllounds made them with a purpose. And he went to Kremmlin' to get Sheriff Burley. And he put him wise to the rustlin' of cattle to Elgeria. And he fetched him up to White Slides to accuse Wills Moore. And he trailed his own tracks up here, showing Burley the crooked horse track and the little circle that was supposed to be made by the end of Moore's crutch, and he led Burley with his men right to this cabin and to the trail where you drove the cattle over the divide. And then he had Burley dig out some cakes of mud holding these tracks, and they fetched them down to White Slides. Buster Jack blamed the stealin' onto Moore, and Burley arrested Moore. The trial comes off next week at Kremlin." "Damn me!" exclaimed Folsom wonderingly. "A man's never too old to learn. I knowed this pup was stealin' from his own father, but I reckoned he was just a natural born honest rustler with a hunch for drink and cards." "Well, he's double-crossed you, Cap, and if I hadn't rounded you up your chances would have been good for swinging." "Uh-huh. Wade, I'd sure preferred them chances of swingin' to your over-kind interferin' in my business. Always interferin', Wade. That's your weakness. But gimme a gun." "I reckon not, Cap." "Gimme a gun," roared the rustler. "Lemme sit here and shoot the eyes out of this lyin' pup of a bellhound's. Wade, put a gun in my hand. A gun with 2 shells, or only 1. You can stand with your gun at my head. Let me kill this skunk." For all bellhounds could tell, death was indeed close. No trace of a bellhound's was apparent about him then, and his face was a horrid spectacle for a man to be forced to see. A froth foamed over his hanging lower lip. "Cap, I ain't trustin' you with a gun just this particular minute," said Wade. Folsom then bawled his curses to his comrades. "Kill him! Throw your guns and bore him! Right in them bulgin' eyes! I'm tellin' you, we gotta fight anyhow. We're a-goin' to cash right here. But kill him first!" Neither of Folsom's lieutenants yielded to the fierce exhortation of their leader, or to their own evilly expressed passions. It was Wade who dominated them. Then ensued a silence fraught with suspense, growing more charged every long instant. The balance here seemed about to be struck. "Wade, I've been a gambler all my life, and a damn smart one if I do say it myself," declared the rustler leader, his voice inharmonious with the facetiousness of his words. "And I'll make a last bet." "Go ahead, Cap. What'll you bet?" answered the cold voice, still gentle, but different now in its inflection. "By Gawd, I'll bet all the gold here that Hell-Bent Wade wouldn't shoot any man in the back." "You win." Slowly and stiffly the rustler rose to his feet. When he reached his height, he deliberately swung his leg to kick Belllounds in the face. "There, I'd like to have a reckonin' with you, Buster Jack," he said. "I ain't dealin' the cards here, but somethin' tells me that shaky as I am in my boots, I'd liefer be in mine than yours." With that, and expelling a heavy breath, he wrestled around to confront the hunter. "Wade, I've no hunch to your game, but it's slower 'n I recollect you." "Why, Cap, I was in a talking humor," replied Wade. "Hell! You're up to some dodge. What'd you care for my learnin' that pup had double-crossed me? You won't let me kill him." "I reckon I wanted him to learn what real men thought of him." "Ahuh! Well, and now I've enlightened him, what's the next deal?" "You'll all go to Kremmlin' with me, and I'll turn you over to Sheriff Burley." That was the gauntlet thrown down by Wade. It was not unexpected, and acceptance seemed a relief. Folsom's eyeballs became living fire with the desperate gleam of the reckless chances of life. Cutthroat he might have been, but he was brave, and he proved the significance of Wade's attitude. "Pards, here's to luck!" he rang out hoarsely, and with pantherish quickness he leaped for his gun. A tense, surcharged instant. Then all 4 men, as if released by some galvanized current of rapidity, flashed into action. Guns boomed in unison. Spurts of red, clouds of smoke, ringing reports, and hoarse cries filled the cabin. Wade had fired as he leaped. There was a thudding patter of lead upon the walls. The hunter flung himself prostrate behind the bough framework that had served as bedstead. It was made of spruce boughs, thick and substantial. Wade had not calculated falsely in estimating it as a bulwark of defense. Pulling his second gun, he peeped from behind the covert. Smoke was lifting and drifting out of door and windows. The atmosphere cleared. Belllounds sagged against the wall, pallid, with protruding eyes of horror on the scene before him. The dark-skinned little man lay writhing. All at once a tremor stilled his convulsions. His body relaxed limply. As if by magic, his hand loosened on the smoking gun. Folsom was on his knees, reeling and swaying, waving his gun, peering like a drunken man for some lost object. His temple appeared half shot away, a bloody and horrible sight. "Pards, I got him," he said in strange, half-strangled whisper. "I got him. Hell-Bent Wade. My respects. I'll meet you there." His reeling motion brought his gaze in line with Belllounds. The violence of his start sent drops of blood flying from his gory temple. "Ha ha! The cards run my way. Belllounds, here's to your lyin' eyes." The gun wavered and trembled and circled. Folsom strained in last terrible effort of will to aim it straight. He fired. The bullet tore hair from Belllounds' head, but missed him. Again the rustler aimed, and the gun wavered and shook. He pulled trigger. The hammer clicked upon an empty chamber. With low and gurgling cry of baffled rage, Folsom dropped the gun and sank face forward, slowly stretching out. The red-bearded rustler had leaped behind the stone chimney that all but hid his body. The position made it difficult for him to shoot because his gun hand was on the inside, and he had to press his body tight to squeeze it behind the corner of ragged stone. Wade had the advantage. He was lying prone, with his right hand round the corner of the framework. An overhang of the bough ends above protected his head when he peeped out. While he watched for a chance to shoot, he loaded his empty gun with his left hand. The rustler strained and writhed his body, twisting his neck, and suddenly darting out his head and arm, he shot. His bullet tore the overhang of boughs above Wade's face, and Wade's answering shot, just a second too late, chipped the stone corner where the rustler's face had flashed out. The bullet, glancing, hummed out of the window. It was a close shave. The rustler let out a hissing, inarticulate cry. He was trapped. In his effort to press in closer, he projected his left elbow beyond the corner of the chimney. Wade's quick shot shattered his arm. There was no asking or offering of quarter here. This was the old feud of the West, of the vicious and the righteous in strife, both reared in the same stern school. The rustler gave his body such contortion that he was twisted almost clear around, with his right hand over his left shoulder. He punched the muzzle of his gun into a crack between two stones, and he pried to open them. The dry clay cement crumbled, the crack widened. Sighting along the barrel, he aimed it with the narrow strip of Wade's shoulder that was visible above the framework. Then he shot and hit. Wade shrank flatter and closer, hiding himself to better advantage. The rustler made his great blunder then, for in that moment he might have rushed out and killed his adversary. But instead he shot again, another time, a third, and his heavy bullets tore and splintered the boughs dangerously close to the hunter's head. Then came an awkward, almost hopeless task for the rustler in maintaining his position while reloading his gun. He did it, and his panting attested to the labor and pain it cost him. So much, in fact, that he let his knee protrude. Wade fired, breaking that knee. The rustler sagged in his tracks. His hip stuck out to afford a target for the remorseless Wade. Still the doomed man did not cry out. though it was evident that he could not now keep his body from sagging into sight of the hunter. Then, with a desperate courage, worthy of a better cause, and with a spirit great in its defeat, the rustler plunged out from his hiding place, gun extended. His red beard, his gaunt face, fierce and baleful, his wobbling plunge that was really a fall, made a sight which was terrible. He hopped out of that fall. His gun began to blaze, but it only matched the blazes of Wade's, and the rustler pitched headlong over the framework, falling heavily against the wall beyond. Then there was silence for a long moment. Wade stirred as if to look around. Belllounds also stirred and gulped as if to breathe. The three prostrate rustlers lay inert, their positions singularly tragic and settled. The smoke again began to lift, to float out of the door and windows. In another moment the big room seemed less hazy. Wade rose, not without effort, and he had a gun in each hand. Those hands were bloody. There was blood on his face, and his left shoulder was red. He approached Belllounds. Wade was terrible then, terrible with a ruthlessness that was no pretense. To Belllounds it must have represented death, a bloody death, which he was not prepared to meet. "Come out of your trance, you pup rustler!" yelled Wade. "For God's sake, don't kill me!" implored Belllounds, stricken with terror. "Why not? Look around. My busy day, Buster. And for that Cap Folsom, it's been 10 years comin'. I'm going to shoot you in the belly and watch you get sick to your stomach." Belllounds, with whisper and hands and face, begged for his life in an abjectness of sheer panic. "What?" roared the hunter. "Didn't you know I come to kill you?" Yes, I've seen that. It's awful. I never harmed you. Don't kill me. Let me live, Wade. I swear to God I'll never do it again. For Dad's sake. For Collie's sake. Don't kill me." "I'm hell-bent Wade. You wouldn't listen to them when they wanted to tell you who I am." Every word of Wade's drove home to this boy the primal meaning of sudden death. It inspired him with an unutterable fear. That was what clamped his brow in a sweaty band and upreared his hair and rolled his eyeballs. His magnified intelligence, almost ghastly, grasped a hope in Wade's apparent vacillation and in the utterance of the name of Columbine. Intuition, a subtle sense, inspired him to beg in that name. "Swear you'll give up, Collie!" demanded Wade, brandishing his guns with bloody hands. Yes, my God, I'll do anything," moaned Belllounds. "Swear you'll tell your father you'd had a change of heart. You'll give Collie up. Let Moore have her." "I swear. But if you tell Dad I stole his cattle, he'll do for me." "We won't squeal that. I'll save you if you give up the girl. Once more, Buster Jack. Try and make me believe you'll square the deal." Belllounds had lost his voice, but his mute, fluttering lips were infinite proof of the vow he could not speak. The boyishness, the stunted moral force, replaced the manhood in him then. He was only a factor in the lives of others, protected even from this nemesis by the greatness of his father's love. "Get up and take my scarf," said Wade, "and bandage these bullet holes I got." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wade's wounds were not in any way serious, and with Belllounds' assistance he got to the cabin of Lewis, where weakness from loss of blood made it necessary that he remain. Belllounds went home. The next day Wade sent Lewis with Packhorse down to the rustler's cabin to bury the dead men and fetch back their effects. Lewis returned that night, accompanied by Sheriff Burley and 2 deputies, who had been busy on their own account. They had followed horse tracks from the waterhole under Gore Peak to the scene of the fight, and had arrived to find Lewis there. Burley had appropriated the considerable amount of gold, which he said could be identified by cattlemen who had bought the stolen cattle. When opportunity afforded, Burley took advantage of it to speak to Wade when the others were out of earshot. "There was another man in that cabin when the fight come off," announced the sheriff, "and he come up here with you." "Jim, you're locoed," replied Wade. The sheriff laughed, and his shrewd eyes had a kindly, curious gleam. "Next you'll be giving me a hunch that you're in a fever and out of your head." "Jim, I'm not as clear-headed as I might be." "Well, tell me or not, just as you like. I seen his tracks, followed them. An' Wade, old pard, I've reckoned long ago there's a nigger in the woodpile." "Sure, and you know me. I'd take it friendly of you to put Moore's trial off for a while, till I'm able to ride to Kremmlin'. Maybe then I can tell you a story." Burley threw up his hands in genuine apprehension. "Not much. You ain't a-goin' to tell me no story. But I'll wait on you and welcome. Reckon I owe you a good deal on this rustler roundup. Wade, that must have been a man-sized fight, even for you. I picked up 26 empty shells, and the little half-breed had 1 empty shell and 5 loaded ones in his gun. You must have got him quick, hey? Jim, I'm observin' you're a heap more curious than ever, and you always was an inquisitive cuss," complained Wade. "I don't recollect what happened." "Well, well, have it your own way," replied Burley with good nature. "Now, Wade, I'll pitch camp here in the park tonight, and tomorrow I'll ride down to White Slides on my way to Kremmlin'. What are you wantin' me to tell Belllounds?" The hunter pondered a moment. "Reckon it's just as well that you tell him somethin'. You can say the rustlers are done for, and that he'll get his stock back. I'd like you to tell him that the rustlers were more to blame than Wils Moore. Just say that and nothin' else about Wils. Don't mention about your suspectin' there was another man around when the fight come off. Tell the cowboys that I'll be down in a few days. And if you happen to get a chance for a word alone with Miss Collie, just say I'm not bad hurt and that all will be well." "Uh-huh." Burley grunted out the familiar exclamation. He did not say any more then, but he gazed thoughtfully down upon the pale hunter, as if that strange individual was one infinitely to respect, but never to comprehend. Wade's wounds healed quickly. Nevertheless, it was more than several days before he felt spirit enough to undertake the ride. He had to return to White Slides, but he was reluctant to do so. Memory of Jack Belllounds dragged at him, and when he drove it away it continually returned. This feeling was almost equivalent to an augmentation of his gloomy foreboding, which ever hovered on the fringe of his consciousness. But one morning he started early, and riding very slowly, with many rests, he reached the Sage Valley cabin before sunset. Moore saw him coming, yelled his delight and concern, and almost lifted him off the horse. Wade was too tired to talk much, but he allowed himself to be fed and put to bed and worked over. "Boots on the other foot now, pard," said Moore, with delight at the prospect of returning service. "Say, you're all shot up. And it's I who'll be nurse." "Wils, I'll be around tomorrow," replied the hunter. "Have you heard any news from down below?" "Sure, I've met Lem every night." Then he related Burley's version of Wade's fight with the rustlers in the cabin. From the sheriff's lips the story gained much. Old Bill Belllounds had received the news in a singular mood. He offered no encomiums to the victor. Contrary to his usual custom of lauding every achievement of labor or endurance, he now seemed almost to regret the affray. Jack Belllounds had returned from Kremmlin', and he was present when Burley brought news of the rustlers. What he thought, none of the cowboys vouchsafed to say, but he was drunk the next day, and he lost a handful of gold to them. Never had he gambled so recklessly. Indeed, it was as if he hated the gold he lost. Little had been seen of Columbine, but little was sufficient to make the cowboys feel concern. Wade made scarcely any comment upon this news from the ranch. Next day, however, he was up and caring for himself, and he told more about the fight and how he had terrorized Belllounds and extorted the promises from him. "Never in God's world will Buster Jack live up to those promises," cried Moore with absolute conviction. "I know him, Ben. He meant them when he made them. He'd swear his soul away. Then next day he'd lie or forget or betray." "I'm not believin' that till I know," replied the hunter gloomily. "But I'm afraid of him. I've known bad men to change. There's a grain of good in all men, somethin' divine, and it comes out now and then. Men rise on steppin' stones of their dead selves to higher things. This is Belllounds's chance for the good in him. If it's not there, he will do as you say. If it is, that scare he had will be the turnin' point in his life. I'm hopin', but I'm afraid." "Ben, you wait and see," said Moore earnestly. "Heaven knows I'm not one to lose hope for my fellow men, hope for the higher things you've taught me. But human nature is human nature. Jack can't give Collie up, just the same as I can't. That's self-preservation as well as love." The day came when Wade walked down to White Slides. There seemed to be a fever in his blood, which he tried to convince himself was a result of his wounds instead of the condition of his mind. It was Sunday, a day of sunshine and squall, of azure blue sky and great sailing purple clouds. The sage of the hills glistened, and there was a sweetness in the air. The cowboys made much of Wade, but the old rancher, seeing him from the porch, abruptly went into the house. No one but Wade noticed this omission of courtesy. Directly Columbine appeared, waving her hand and running to meet him. "Dad saw you. He told me to come out and excuse him. Oh, Ben, I'm so happy to see you. You don't look hurt at all. What a fight you had. Oh, I was sick. But let me forget that. How are you? And how's Wils?" Thus she babbled until out of breath. "Collie, it's sure good to see you," said Wade, feeling the old, rich thrill at her presence. "I'm comin' on tolerable well. I wasn't bad hurt, but I bled a lot. And I reckon I'm older'n I was when packin' gunshot holes was nothin'. Every year tells, only a man doesn't know till after. And how are you, Collie?" Her blue eyes clouded, and a tremor changed the expression of her sweet lips. "I am unhappy, Ben," she said. "But what could we expect? It might be worse. For instance, you might have been killed. I've much to be thankful for." "I reckon so. We all have. I've fetched a message from Wils, but I oughtn't tell it." "Please do," she begged, wistfully. "Well, Wils says, 'Tell Collie I love her every day more and more, and that my love keeps up my courage and my belief in God. And if she ever marries Jack Belllounds, she can come up to visit my grave among the Columbines on the hill.'" Strange how Wade experienced comfort in thus torturing her. She was rosy at the beginning of his speech and white at its close. "Oh, it's true," she whispered. "It'll kill him, as it will me." "Cheer up, Columbine," said Wade. "It's a long time till August 13th. And now tell me, why did old Bill run when he saw me coming?" "Ben, I suspect Dad has the queerest notion you want to tell him some awful bloody story about the rustlers." "Uh-huh. Well, not yet. And how's Jack Belllounds actin' these days?" Wade felt the momentousness of that query, but it seemed her face had been telltale enough, without confirmation of words. "My friend, somehow I hate to tell you. You're always so hopeful, so ready to think good instead of evil. But Jack has been rough with me, almost brutal. He was drunk once. Every day he drinks, sometimes a little, sometimes more. But drink changes him, and it's dragging Dad down. Dad doesn't say so, yet I feel he's afraid of what will come next. Jack has nagged me to marry him right off. He wanted to the day he came back from Kremmling. He's eager to leave White Slides. Dad knows that also, and it worries him. But of course I refused." The presence of Columbine, so vivid and sweet and stirring, and all about her the sunlight, the golden gleams on the sage hills, and Wade's heart and brain and spirit sustained a subtle transformation. It was as if what had been beautiful with light had suddenly, strangely darkened. Then Wade imagined he stood alone in a gloomy house, which was his own heart, and he was listening to the arrival of a tragic messenger whose foot sounded heavy on the stairs, whose hand turned slowly upon the knob, whose gray presence opened the door and crossed the threshold. "Buster Jack didn't break off with you, Collie?" asked the hunter. "Break off with me? No, indeed. Whatever possessed you to say that?" "And he didn't offer to give you up to Will's Moor?" "Ben, are you crazy?" cried Columbine. "Collie, listen. I'll tell you." The old urge knocked at Wade's mind. "Buster Jack was in the cabin, gamblin' with the rustlers, when I cornered them. You remember I meant to scare Buster Jack within an inch of his life? Well, I made use of my opportunity. I worked up the rustlers. Then I told Jack I'd give away his secret. He made to jump and run, I reckon, but he hadn't the nerve. I shot a piece out of his ear just to begin the fun, and then I told the rustlers how Jack had double-crossed them. Folsom, the boss rustler, roared like a mad steer. He was wild to kill Jack. He begged for a gun to shoot out Jack's eyes. And so were the other rustlers burnin' to kill him. Bad outfit. There was a fight, which I'm bound to confess was not short and sweet. There was a lot of shootin'. And in a cabin, gunshots almost lift the roof. Folsom was on his knees, dying, waving his gun, whispering in fiendish glee that he had done for me. When he saw Jack and remembered, he shook so with fury that he scattered blood all over. And he took long aim at Jack, trying to steady his gun. He couldn't, and he missed, and then fell over dead with his head on Jack's knees. That left the red-bearded rustler, who had hid behind the chimney. Jack watched the rest of that fight, and for a youngster it must have been nerve-racking. I broke the rustler's arm, and then his knee, and then I got him in the hip 2 more times before he hobbled out to his finish. He'd shot me up considerable, so that when I braced Jack I must have been a hair-raisin' sight. I made Jack believe I meant to murder him. He begged and cried, and he got to prayin' for his life for your sake. It was sickenin', but it was what I wanted. So then I made him swear he'd free you and give you up to Moore." "Oh, Ben, how awful!" whispered Columbine, shuddering. "How could you tell me such a horrible story?" "Reckon I wanted you to know how Jack come to make the promises and what they were." "Promises? What are promises or oaths to Jack Belllounds?" she cried in passionate contempt. "You wasted your breath. Coward, liar that he is." "Uh-huh." Wade looked straight ahead of him, as if he saw some expected and unpleasant thing far in the distance. Then, with irresistible steps, neither swift nor slow, but ponderous, he strode to the porch and mounted the steps. "Why, Ben, where are you going?" called Columbine in surprise as she followed him. He did not answer. He approached the closed door of the living room. "Ben!" cried Columbine in alarm. But he had no reply for her, indeed no thought of her. Without knocking, he opened the door with rude and powerful hand, and, striding in, closed it after him. Bill Belllounds was standing, back against the great stone chimney, arms folded, a stolid and grim figure, apparently fortified against an intrusion he had expected. "Well, what do you want?" he asked, gruffly. He had sensed catastrophe in the first sight of the hunter. "Belllounds, I reckon I want a hell of a lot," replied Wade. "And I'm askin' you to see we're not disturbed. Bar the door." Wade dropped the bar in place, and then, removing his sombrero, he wiped his moist brow. "Do you see an enemy in me?" he asked curiously. "Speakin' out fair, Wade, there ain't any reason I can see that you're an enemy to me," replied Belllounds. "But I feel somethin'. It ain't because I'm takin' my son's side. It's more than that. A queer feelin', an' one I never had before. I got it first when you told the story of the Gunnison feud. Belllounds, we can't escape our fates, and it was written long ago I was to tell you a worse and harder story than that." "Wal, mebbe I'll listen, an' mebbe I won't. I ain't promisin' these days." "Are you goin' to make Collie marry Jack?" demanded the hunter. "She's willing." "You know that's not true. Collie's willin' to sacrifice love, honor, an' life itself to square her debt to you." The old rancher flushed a burning red, and in his eyes flared a spirit of earlier years. "Wade, you can go too far," he warned. "I'm appreciatin' your good-heartedness. It sort of warms me toward you. But this is my business. You've no call to interfere. You've done that too much already. An' I'm reckonin' Collie would be married to Jack now if it hadn't been for you. Ahuh! That's why I'm thankin' God I happened along to White Slides. Belllounds, your big mistake is thinkin' your son is good enough for this girl. An' you're makin' mistakes about me. I've interfered here, an' you may take my word for it I had the right." "Strange talk, Wade, but I'll make allowances." "You needn't. I'll back my talk. But first I'm asking you, an' if this talk hurts I'm sorry, why don't you give some of your love for your no-good Buster Jack to Collie?" Belllounds clenched his huge fists and glared. Anger leaped within him. He recognized in Wade an outspoken, bitter adversary to his cherished hopes for his son and his stubborn, precious pride. "By Heaven, Wade, I'll..." "Belllounds, I can make you swallow that kind of talk," interrupted Wade. "It's man to man now, and I'm a match for you any day. Savvy? Do you think I'm damn fool enough to come here and brace you unless I knew that? Talk to me as you'd talk about some other man's son." "It ain't possible," rejoined the rancher stridently. "Then listen to me first. Your son Jack, to say the least, will ruin Collie. Do you see that?" "By God, I'm afraid so," groaned Belllounds, big in his humiliation. "But it's my one last bet, and I'm goin' to play it." "Do you know marrying him will kill her?" "What? You're overdoin' your fears, Wade. Women don't die so easy." "Some of them die, and Collie's one that will, if she ever marries Jack." "If? Well, she's going to." "We don't agree," said Wade curtly. "Are you runnin' my family?" "No, but I'm runnin' a large-sized if in this game. You'll admit that presently. Belllounds, you make me mad. You don't meet me man to man. You're not the Bill Belllounds of old. Why, all over this state of Colorado you're known as the whitest of the white. Your name's a byword for all that's square and big and splendid. But you're so blinded by your worship of that wild boy that you're another man in all pertainin' to him. I don't want to harp on his shortcomes. I'm for the girl. She doesn't love him. She can't. She will only drag herself down and die of a broken heart. Now, I'm asking you, before it's too late, give up this marriage." "Wade, I've shot men for less than you've said," thundered the rancher, beside himself with rage and shame. "Ahuh! I reckon you have. But not men like me. I tell you straight to your face, it's a fool deal you're workin', a damn selfish one, a dirty job to put on an innocent, sweet girl. And as sure as you stand there, if you do it, you'll ruin 4 lives." "4?" exclaimed Belllounds, but any word would have expressed his humiliation. "I should have said 3, leavin' Jack out. I meant Collie's and yours and Wils Moore's. Moore's is about ruined already, I've a hunch." You can get hunches you never dreamed of, Belllounds, old as you are. And I'll give you one presently. But we drift off. Can't you keep cool? Cool? With you rantin' hell-bent for election? Ha! Raw! Wade, you're locoed. You always struck me queer. And if you'll excuse me, I'm getting tired of this talk. We're as far apart as the poles. And to save what good feelings we both have, let's quit. You don't love Collie, then? Queried Wade, imperturbably. Yes, I do. That's a fool idea of yours. It puts me out of patience. Belllounds, you're not her real father. The rancher gave a start, and he stared as he had stared before, fixedly and perplexedly at Wade. No, I'm not. If she were your real daughter, your own flesh and blood, and Jack Belllounds was my son, would you let her marry him? Well, Wade, I reckon I wouldn't. Then how can you expect my consent to her marriage with your son? What? Belllounds lunged over to Wade, leaned down, shaken by overwhelming amaze. Collie is my daughter. A loud expulsion of breath escaped Belllounds. Lower he leaned, and looked with piercing gaze into the face and eyes that in this moment bore strange resemblance to Columbine. So help me God, that's the secret. Hell-bent Wade, and you've been on my trail. He staggered to his big chair and fell into it. No trace of doubt showed in his face. The revelation had struck home because of its very greatness. Wade took the chair opposite. His likeness to Columbine had faded now. It had been love, a spirit, a radiance, a glory. It was gone, and Wade's face became the emblem of tragedy. Listen, Belllounds, I'll tell you. The ways of God are inscrutable. I've been 20 years trying to atone for the wrong I did Collie's mother. I've been a prospector for the trouble of others. I've been a bearer of their burdens. And if I can save Collie's happiness and her soul, I reckon I won't be denied the peace of meeting her mother in the other world. I recognized Collie the moment I laid eyes on her. She favors her mother in looks, and she has her mother's sensitiveness, her fire and pride, and she even has her voice. It's low and sweet, alto they used to call it, but I'd recognized Collie as my own if I'd been blind and deaf. It's over 18 years ago that we had the trouble. I was no boy, but I was terribly in love with Lucy, and she loved me with a passion I never learned till too late. We came west from Missouri. She was born in Texas. I had a roving disposition and didn't stick long at any kind of work, but I was looking for a ranch. My wife had some money, and I had high hopes. We spent our first year of married life traveling through Kansas. At Dodge, I got tied up for a while. You know, in them days, Dodge was about the wildest camp on the plains. My wife's brother run a place there. He wasn't much good, but she thought he was perfect. Strange how blood relations can't see the truth about their own people. Anyway, her brother Spencer had no use for me, because I could tell how slick he was with the cards and beat him at his own game. Spencer had a gambling pard, a cowboy run out of Texas, one Cap Fop, but no matter about his name. One night they were fleecing a stranger, and I broke into the game, winning all they had. The game ended in a fight, with bloodshed, but nobody killed. That set Spencer and his pard Cap against me. The stranger was a planter from Louisiana. He'd been an officer in the rebel army, a high-strung, handsome Southerner, fond of wine and cards and women. Well, he got to paying my wife a good deal of attention when I was away, which happened to be often. She never told me. I was jealous those days. My little girl you call Columbine was born there during a long absence of mine. When I got home, Lucy and the baby were gone. Also the Southerner. Spencer and his pard Cap and others they had in the deal proved to me, so it seemed, that the little girl was not really mine. And so I set out on a hunt for my wife and her lover. I found them, and I killed him before her eyes. But she was innocent, and so was he, as came out too late. He'd been indeed her friend. She scorned me. She told me how her brother Spencer and his friends had established guilt of mine that had driven her from me. I went back to Dodge to have a little quiet smoke with these men who had ruined me. They were gone. The trail led to Colorado. Nearly a year later, I rounded them all up in a big wagon train post north of Denver. Another brother of my wife's and her father had come west, and by accident or fate we all met there. We had a family quarrel. My wife would not forgive me, would not speak to me, and her people backed her up. I made the great mistake to take her father and other brothers to belong to the same brand as Spencer. In this I wronged them and her. What I did to them, Belllounds, is one story I'll never tell to any man who might live to repeat it. But it drove my wife near crazy, and it made me hell-bent Wade. She ran off from me there, and I trailed her all over Colorado. And the end of that trail was not 100 miles from where we stand now. The last trace I had was of the burning of a prairie schooner by Arapahoes as they were going home from a foray on the Utes. The little girl might have toddled off the trail, but I reckon she was hidden or dropped by her mother or someone fleeing for life. Your men found her in the Columbines." Belllounds drew a long, deep breath. "What a man never expects always comes true. Wade, the lass is yours. I can see it in the way you look at me. I can feel it. She's been like my own. I've done my best, according to my conscience. And I've loved her, for all they say I couldn't see aught but Jack. You'll take her away from me?" "No, never," was the melancholy reply. "What? Why not?" "Because she loves you. I could never reveal myself to Collie. I couldn't win her love with a lie. And I'd have to lie, to be false as hell. False to her mother and to Collie and to all I hold high. I'd have to tell Collie the truth, the wrong I did her mother, the hell I visited upon her mother's people. She'd fear me." "Uh-huh. And you'll never change. I reckon that," exclaimed Belllounds. "No. I changed once 18 years ago. I can't go back. I can't undo all I hoped was good." "You think Collie'd fear you?" "She'd never love me as she does you, or as she loves me even now. That is my rock of refuge." "She'd hate you, Wade." "I reckon. And so she must never know." "Uh-huh. Well, life is a hell of a deal. Wade, if you could live yours over again, knowing what you know now, and that you'd love and suffer the same, would you want to do it?" "Yes. I love life with all it brings. I wouldn't have the joy without the pain. But I reckon only men who've come to our years would want it over again." "Well, I'm with you there. I'd take what came, rain and sun. But all this you tell, and the hell you hint at, ain't changin' this here deal of Jack's and Collie's. Not one jot. If she remains my adopted daughter, she marries my son. Wade, I'm haltered like the North Star in that." "Belllounds, will you take a day to think it over?" appealed Wade. "Uh-huh. But that won't change me." "Won't it change you to know that if you force this marriage you'll lose all?" "All? Ain't that more queer talk?" "I mean lose all. Your son, your adopted daughter, his chance of reformin', her hope of happiness. These ought to be all in life left to you." "Well, they are. But I can't see your argument. You're beyond me, Wade. You're holding back like you did with your hell-bent story." Ponderously, as if the burden and the doom of the world weighed him down, the hunter got up and fronted Belllounds. "When I'm driven to tell, I'll come. But once more, old man, choose between generosity and selfishness, between blood tie and noble loyalty to your good deed in its beginning. Will you give up this marriage for your son, so that Collie can have the man she loves. You mean your young pard and two-bit of a rustler, Wills Moore." "Wills Moore, yes. My friend, and a man, Belllounds, such as you or I never was." "No!" thundered the rancher, purple in the face. With bowed head and dragging step, Wade left the room. By slow degrees of plodding steps and periods of abstracted lagging, the hunter made his way back to Moore's cabin. At his entrance the cowboy leaped up with a startled cry. "Oh, Wade, is Collie dead?" he cried. Such was the extent of calamity he imagined from the somber face of Wade. "No, Collie's well." "Then, man, what on earth's happened?" "Nothin' yet, but somethin' is goin' on in my mind. Moore, I'd like you to let me alone." At sunset Wade was pacing the aspen grove on the hill. There was sunlight and shade under the trees, a rosy gold on the sage slopes, a purple and violet veil between the black ranges and the sinking sun. Twilight fell. The stars came out white and clear. Night cloaked the valley with dark shadows, and the hills with its obscurity. The blue vault overhead deepened and darkened. The hunter patrolled his beat, and hours were moments to him. He heard the low hum of the insects, the murmur of running water, the rustle of the wind. A coyote cut the keen air with high-keyed staccato cry. The owls hooted with dismal and weird plaint, one to the other. Then a wolf mourned, but these sounds only accentuated the loneliness and wildness of the silent night. Wade listened to them, to the silence. He felt the wildness and loneliness of the place, the breathing of nature. He peered aloft at the velvet blue of the mysterious sky with its deceiving stars. All that had been of help to him through days of trial was now as if it had never been. When he lifted his eyes to the great dark peak, so bold and clear-cut against the sky, it was not to receive strength again. Nature in its cruelty mocked him. His struggle had to do with the most perfect of nature's works, man. Wade was now in passionate strife with the encroaching mood that was a mocker of his idealism. Many times during the strange, long martyrdom of his penance had he faced this crisis, only to go down to defeat before elemental instincts. His soul was steeped in gloom, but his intelligence had not yet succumbed to passion. The beauty of Columbine's character and the nobility of Moore's were not illusions to Wade. They were true. These two were of the finest fiber of human nature. They loved. They represented youth and hope, a progress through the ages toward a better race. Wade believed in the good to be, in the future of men. Nevertheless, all that was fine and worthy in Columbine and Moore was to go unrewarded, unfulfilled, because of the selfish pride of an old man and the evil passion of the son. It was a conflict as old as life. Of what avail were Columbine's high sense of duty, Moore's fine manhood, the many victories they had won over the headlong and imperious desires of love? What avail were Wade's good offices, his spiritual teaching, his eternal hope in the order of circumstances working out to good? These beautiful characteristics of virtue were not so strong as the unchangeable passion of old Belllounds and the vicious depravity of his son. Wade could not imagine himself a god, proving that the wages of sin was death. Yet in his life he had often been an impassive destiny, meting out terrible consequences. Here he was incalculably involved. This was the cumulative end of years of mounting plots, tangled and woven into the web of his pain and his remorse and his ideal. But hope was dying. That was his strife realization against the morbid clairvoyance of his mind. He could not help Jack Belllounds to be a better man. He could not inspire the old rancher to a forgetfulness of selfish and blinded aims. He could not prove to Moore the truth of the reward that came from unflagging hope and unassailable virtue. He could not save Columbine with his ideals. The night wore on, and Wade plodded under the rustling aspens. The insects ceased to hum, the owls to hoot, the wolves to mourn. The shadows of the long spruces gradually merged into the darkness of night. Above, infinitely high, burned the pale stars, wise and cold, aloof and indifferent, eyes of other worlds of mystery. In those night hours something in Wade died. But his idealism, unquenchable and inexplicable, the very soul of the man, saw its justification and fulfillment in the distant future. The gray of the dawn stole over the eastern range, and before its opaque gloom the blackness of night retreated, until valley and slope and grove were shrouded in spectral light where all seemed unreal. And with it the gray-gloomed giant of Wade's mind, the morbid and brooding spell, had gained its long-encroaching ascendancy. He had again found the man to whom he must tell his story. Tragic and irrevocable decree. It was his life that forced him, his crime, his remorse, his agony, his endless striving. How true had been his steps! They had led by devious and tortuous paths to the home of his daughter. Wade crouched under the aspens, accepting this burden as a man being physically loaded with tremendous weights. His shoulders bent to them. His breast was sunken and labored. All his muscles were cramped. His blood flowed sluggishly. His heart beat with slow, muffled throbs in his ears. There was a creeping cold in his veins, ice in his marrow, and death in his soul. The giant that had been shrouded in gray threw off his cloak to stand revealed, black and terrible. And it was he who spoke to Wade in dreadful tones like knells. Bent Wade, man of misery, who could find no peace on earth, whose presence unknit the tranquil lives of people and poisoned their blood and marked them for doom. Wherever he wandered, there followed the curse. Always this had been so. He was the harbinger of catastrophe. He who preached wisdom and claimed to be taught by the flowers, who loved life and hated injustice, who mingled with his kind, ever searching for that one who needed him. He must become the woe and the bane and curse of those he would only serve. Insupportable and pitiful fate. The fiends of the past mocked him like wicked ghouls, voiceless and dim. The faces of the men he had killed were around him in the gray gloom, pale, drifting visages of distortion, accusing him, claiming him. Likewise these gleams of faces were spectres of his mind, a procession eternal, mournful, and silent, wending their way on and on through the regions of his thought. All were united, all drove him, all put him on the trail of catastrophe. They foreshadowed the future, they enclosed events, they lured him with his endless illusions. He was in the vortex of a vast whirlpool, not of water or of wind, but of life. Alas, he seemed indeed the very current of that whirlpool, a monstrous force around which evil circled and lurked and conquered. Wade, who had the ill-omened croak of the raven, Wade, who bent his driven steps toward hell. In the brilliant sunlight of the summer morning, Wade bent his resistless steps down toward White Slides Ranch. The pendulum had swung. The hours were propitious. Seemingly, events that already cast their shadows waited for him. He saw Jack Belllounds going out on the fast and furious ride which had become his morning habit. Columbine intercepted Wade. The shade of woe and tragedy in her face were the same as he had pictured there in his gloomy vigil of the night. "My friend, I was coming to you. Oh, I can bear no more." Her hair was disheveled, her dress disordered. The hands she tremblingly held out bore discolored marks. Wade led her into the seclusion of the willow trail. "Oh, Ben, he fought me like a beast," she panted. "Collie, you needn't tell me more," said Wade, gently. "Go up to Wils. Tell him." "But I must tell you. I can bear no more. He fought me, hurt me. And when Dad heard us and came, Jack lied. Oh, the dog! Ben, his father believed when Jack swore he was only mad, only trying to shake me for my indifference and scorn. But my God, Jack meant..." "Collie, go up to Wils," interposed the hunter. "I want to see Wils. I need to. I must. But I'm afraid. Oh, it will make things worse." "Go!" She turned away, actuated by more than her will. "Collie!" came the call, piercingly and strangely after her. Bewildered, startled by the wildness of that cry, she wheeled, but Wade was gone. The shaking of the willows attested to his hurry. Old Belllounds braced his huge shoulders against the wall in the attitude of a man driven to his last stand. "Aha!" he rolled sonorously. "So here you are again. Well, tell your worst, hell-bent Wade, and let's have an end to your croaking." Belllounds had fortified himself, not with convictions or with illusions, but with the last desperate courage of a man true to himself. "I'll tell you," began the hunter, and the rancher threw up his hands in a mockery that was furious, yet with outward shrinking. "Just now, when Buster Jack fought with Collie, he meant bad by her." "Aw, no. He was just rude, tryin' to be masterful. An' the lass is like a wild filly. She needs a tamin' down." Wade stretched forth a lean and quivering hand that seemed the symbol of presaged and tragic truth. "Listen, Belllounds, and I'll tell you. No use tryin' to hatch a rotten egg. There's no good in your son. His good intentions he paraded for virtues, believin' himself that he'd changed. But a flip of the wind made him Buster Jack again. Collie would sacrifice her life for duty to you, whom she loves as her father. Wils Moore sacrificed his honor for Collie, rather than let you learn the truth. But they call me Hell-Bent Wade, and I will tell you." The straining hulk of Belllounds crouched lower, as if to gather impetus for a leap. Both huge hands were outspread, as if to ward off attack from an unseen but long-dreaded foe. The great eyes rolled. And underneath the terror and certainty and tragedy of his appearance seemed to surge the resistless and rising swell of a dammed-up, terrible rage. "I'll tell you," went on the remorseless voice. "I watched your Buster Jack. I watched him gamble and drink. I trailed him. I found the little circles and the crooked horse tracks made to trap Wils Moore. A damned cunnin' trick. Burley suspects a nigger in the woodpile. Wils Moore knows the truth. He lied for Collie's sake and yours. He'd have stood the trial and gone to jail to save Collie from what she dreaded. Belllounds, your son was in the cabin gamblin' with the rustlers when I cornered them. I offered to keep Jack's secret if he'd swear to give Collie up. He swore on his knees, begging in her name. And he comes back to bully her, and worse. Buster Jack. He's the thorn in your heart, Belllounds. He's the rustler who stole your cattle. Your pet son, a sneaking thief." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jack Belllounds came riding down the valley trail. His horse was in a lather of sweat. Both hair and blood showed on the long spurs this son of a great pioneer used in his pleasure rides. He had never loved a horse. At a point where the trail met the brook, there were thick willow patches with open grassy spots between. As Belllounds reached this place, a man stepped out of the willows and laid hold of the bridle. The horse shied and tried to plunge, but an iron arm held him. "Get down, Buster," ordered the man. It was Wade. Belllounds had given as sharp a start as his horse. He was sober, though the heated red tinge of his face gave indication of a recent use of the bottle. That colour quickly receded. Events of the last month had left traces of the hardening and lowering of Jack Belllounds' nature. "What? Let go of that bridle!" he ejaculated. Wade held it fast while he gazed up into the prominent eyes, where fear shone and struggled with intolerance and arrogance and quickening gleams of thought. "You and I have something to talk over," said the hunter. Belllounds shrank from the low, cold, even voice that evidently reminded him of the last time he had heard it. "No, we haven't," he declared quickly. He seemed to gather assurance with his spoken thought, and conscious fear left him. "Wade, you took advantage of me that day when you made me swear things. I've changed my mind. And as for that deal with the rustlers, I've got my story. It's as good as yours. I've been waiting for you to tell my father. You've got some reason for not telling him. I've a hunch it's Collie. I'm on to you, and I've got my nerve back. You can gamble He had grown excited when Wade interrupted him. "Will you get off that horse?" "No, I won't," replied Belllounds bluntly. With swift and powerful lunge, Wade pulled Belllounds down, sliding him shoulders first into the grass. The released horse shied again and moved away. Buster Jack raised himself upon his elbow, pale with rage and alarm. Wade kicked him, not with any particular violence. "Get up," he ordered. The kick had brought out the rage in Belllounds at the expense of the amaze and alarm. "Did you kick me?" he shouted. "Buster, I was only handin' you a bunch of flowers, some Columbines, as your taste runs," replied Wade contemptuously. I'll," returned Buster Jack wildly, bursting for expression. His hand went to his gun. "Go ahead, Buster. Throw your gun on me. That'll save maybe a hell of a lot of talk." It was then Jack Belllounds' face turned livid. Comprehension had dawned upon him. You want me to fight you?" he queried in hoarse accents. "I reckon that's what I meant." No affront, no insult, no blow could have affected Buster Jack as that sudden knowledge. Why, you're crazy! Me fight you? A gunman?" he stammered. No, it wouldn't be fair, not an even break. No, I'd have no chance on earth." "I'll give you first shot," went on Wade in his strange, monotonous voice. "Bah! You're lying to me," replied Belllounds with pale grimace. "You just want me to get a gun in my hand. Then you'll drop me and claim an even break." "No, I'm square. You saw me play square with your rustler pard. He was a lifelong enemy of mine, and a gunfighter to boot. Pull your gun and let drive. I'll take my chances." Buster Jack's eyes dilated. He gasped huskily. He pulled his gun, but actually did not have strength or courage enough to raise it. His arm shook so that the gun rattled against his chaps. "No nerve, eh? Not half a man. Buster Jack, why don't you finish game? Make up for your low-down tricks. At the last, try to be worthy of your dad. In his day, he was a real man. Let him have the consolation that you faced Hellbent Wade and died in your boots." "I can't fight you," panted Belllounds. "I know now. I saw you throw a gun. It wouldn't be fair." "But I'll make you fight me," returned Wade in steely tones. "I'm giving you a chance to dig up a little manhood, asking you to meet me man to man, handing you a little the best of it to make the odds even. Once more, will you be game?" "Wade, I'll not fight. I'm going," replied Belllounds, and he moved as if to turn. "Halt!" Wade leaped at the white Belllounds. "If you run, I'll break a leg for you, and then I'll beat your miserable brains out. Have you no sense? Can't you recognize what's coming? I'm going to kill you, Buster Jack." "My God!" whispered the other, understanding fully at last. "Here's where you pay for your dirty work. The time comes to every man. You've a choice, not to live, for you'll never get away from Hell-Bent Wade, but to rise above yourself at last." "But what for? Why do you want to kill me? I never harmed you." "Columbine is my daughter," replied the hunter. "Ah!" breathed Belllounds. "She loves Wils Moore, who's as white a man as you are black." Across the pallid, convulsed face of Belllounds spread a slow, dull crimson. "Aha, Buster Jack! I struck home there," flashed Wade, his voice rising. "That gives your eyes the ugly look. I hate them lyin', bulgin' eyes of yours. And when my time comes to shoot, I'm going to put them both out." "By Heaven! Wade, you'll have to kill me if you ever expect that clubfoot Moore to get Collie." "He'll get her," replied Wade, triumphantly. "Collie's with him now. I sent her. I told her to tell Wils how you tried to force her." Belllounds began to shake all over. A torture of jealous hate and deadly terror convulsed him. "Buster, did you ever think you'd get her kisses, as Wil's getting right now?" queried the hunter. "Good Lord, the conceit of some men! Why, you poor, weak-minded, cowardly pet of a blinded old man! You conceited ass! You selfish and spoiled boy! Collie never had any use for you, and now she hates you." "It was you who made her!" yelled Belllounds, foaming at the mouth. "Sure," went on the deliberate voice, ringing with scorn. "And only a little while ago she called you a dog. I reckon she meant a different kind of a dog than the hounds over there, for to say they were like you would be an insult to them. Sure, she hates you, and I'll gamble right now she's got her arms around Wil's neck." "Blank," hissed Belllounds. "Well, you've got a gun in your hand," went on the taunting voice. "Ahuh! Have it your way. I'm warmin' up now, and I'd like to tell you—" "Shut up!" interrupted the other frantically. The blood in him was rising to a fever heat, but fear still clamped him. He could not raise the gun, and he seemed in agony. "Your father knows you're a thief," declared Wade, with remorseless, deliberate intent. "I told him how I watched you, trailed you, and learned the plot you hatched against Wils Moore. Buster Jack busted himself at last, stealin' his own father's cattle. I've seen some ragin' men in my day, but Old Bill had them beaten. You've disgraced him, broken his heart, embittered the end of his life. And he'd mean for you what I mean now." "He'd never harm me," gasped Buster Jack, shuddering. "He'd kill you, you white-livered pup," cried Wade with terrible force. "Kill you before he'd let you go to worse dishonor. And I'm going to save him stainin' his hands." "I'll kill you!" burst out Belllounds, ending in a shriek. But this was not the temper that always produced heedless action in him. It was hate. He could not raise the gun. His intelligence still dominated his will, yet fury had mitigated his terror. "You'll be doin' me a service, Buster. But you're mighty slow at startin'. I reckon I'll have to play my last trump to make you fight. Oh, by God, I can tell you. Belllounds, there are dead men callin' me now. calling me not to murder you in cold blood. I killed one man once, a man who wouldn't fight, an innocent man. I killed him with my bare hands, and if I tell you my story, and how I killed him, and that I'll do the same for you, you'll save me that, Buster. No man with a gun in his hands could face what he knew. But save me more, save me the tellin'." "No, no, I won't listen." "Maybe I won't have to," replied Wade mournfully. He paused, breathing heavily. The sober calm was gone. Belllounds lowered the half-raised gun, instantly answering to the strange break in Wade's strained dominance. "Don't tell me any more. I'll not listen. I won't fight. Wade, you're crazy. Let me off and I swear." "Buster, I told Collie you were 3 years in jail," suddenly interrupted Wade. A mortal blow dealt Belllounds would not have caused such a shock of amaze, of torture. The secret of the punishment meted out to him by his father, the hideous thing which, instead of reforming, had ruined him. All of hell was expressed in his burning eyes. "Uh-huh, I've known it long," cried Wade tragically. "Buster Jack, you're the man who must hear my story. I'll tell you." In the aspen grove up the slope of Sage Valley, Columbine and Wilson were sitting on a log. Whatever had been their discourse, it had left Moore with head bowed in his hands, and with Columbine staring with sad eyes that did not see what they looked at. Columbine's mind then seemed a dull blank. Suddenly she started. "Wills," she cried, "did you hear anything?" "No," he replied, wearily raising his head. "I thought I heard a shot," said Columbine. It sort of made me jump. I'm nervous." Scarcely had she finished speaking when 2 clear, deep detonations rang out. Gunshots. "There! Oh, Wills, did you hear?" "Hear?" whispered Moore. He grew singularly white. "Yes, yes, Collie." "Wills," she interrupted wildly as she began to shake. "Just a little bit ago I saw Jack riding down the trail." "Collie, those 2 shots came from Wade's guns. I'd know it among 1,000. Are you sure you heard a shot before?" "Oh, something dreadful has happened. Yes, I'm sure, perfectly sure. A shot not so loud or heavy." "My God!" exclaimed Moore, staring aghast at Columbine. "Maybe that's what Wade meant. I never saw through him." "Tell me! Oh, I don't understand!" wailed Columbine, wringing her hands. Moore did not explain what he meant. For a crippled man, he made quick time in getting to his horse and mounting. "Collie, I'll ride down there. I'm afraid something has happened. I never understood him. I forgot he was Hell-Bent Wade. If there's been a fight or any trouble, I'll ride back and meet you." Then he rode down the trail. Columbine had come without her horse, and she started homeward on foot. Her steps dragged. She knew something dreadful had happened. Her heart beat slowly and painfully. There was an oppression upon her breast. Her brain whirled with contending tides of thought. She remembered Wade's face. How blind she had been! It exhausted her to walk, though she went so slowly. There seemed to be a chill and a darkening in the atmosphere, an unreality in the familiar slopes and groves, a strangeness and shadow upon White Slides Valley. Moore did not return to meet her. His white horse grazed in the pasture opposite the first clump of willows, where Sage Valley merged into the larger valley. Then she saw other horses, among them Lem Billings' bay mustang. Columbine faltered on, when suddenly she recognized the horse Jack had ridden, a sorrel, spent and foam-covered, standing saddled, with bridle down and riderless. Then certainty of something awful clamped her with horror. Men's husky voices reached her throbbing ears. Someone was running. Footsteps thudded and died away. Then she saw Lem Billings come out of the willows, look her way and hurry toward her. His awkward cowboy gait seemed too slow for his earnestness. Columbine felt the piercing gaze of his eyes as her own became dim. "Miss Collie, there's been terrible fight," he panted. "Oh, Lem, I know. It was Ben and Jack," she cried. "Sure, your hunch is correct. And it couldn't be no worse." Columbine tried to see his face, the meaning that must have accompanied his hoarse voice, but she seemed going blind. Then, she whispered, reaching out for Lem. "Here, Miss Collie," he said in great concern as he took kind and gentle hold of her. "Reckon you'd better wait. Let me take you home." "Yes, but tell me first," she cried frantically. She could not bear suspense, and she felt her senses slipping away from her. "My God, who'd ever have thought such hell would come to White Slides!" exclaimed Lem with strong emotion. "Miss Collie, I'm powerful sorry for you, but maybe it's best so. They're both dead. Wade just died with his head on Will's lap. But Jack never knowed what hit him. He was shot plumb center, both his eyes shot out. Wade was shot low down. Montana and me agreed that Jack throwed his gun first and Wade killed him after being mortal shot himself." Late that afternoon, as Columbine lay upon her bed, the strange stillness of the house was disturbed by a heavy tread. It passed out of the living room and came down the porch toward her door. Then followed a knock. "Dad," she called, swiftly rising. Belllounds entered, leaving the door ajar. The sunlight streamed in. "Well, Collie, I see you're bracin' up," he said. "Oh, yes, Dad, I'm all right," she replied, eager to help or comfort him. The old rancher seemed different from the man of the past months. The pallor of a great shock, the havoc of spent passion, the agony of terrible hours showed in his face. But old Bill Belllounds had come into his own again, back to the calm, iron pioneer who had lived all events, over whom storm of years had broken, whose great spirit had accepted this crowning catastrophe as it had all the others, who saw his own life clearly now that its bitterest lesson was told. "Are you strong enough to bear another shock, my lass, and bear it now, so to make an end, so tomorrow we can begin anew?" he asked, with the voice she had not heard for many a day. It was the voice that told of consideration for her. "Yes, Dad," she replied, going to him. "Well, come with me. I want you to see Wade." He led her out upon the porch and thence into the living room, and from there into the room where lay the two dead men, one on each side. Blankets covered the prone, quiet forms. Columbine had meant to beg to see Wade once before he was laid away forever. She dreaded the ordeal, yet strangely longed for it. And here she was self-contained, ready for some nameless shock and uplift, which she divined was coming, as she had divined the change in Belllounds. Then he stripped back the blanket, disclosing Wade's face. Columbine thrilled to the core of her heart. Death was there, white and cold and merciless, but as it had released the tragic soul, the instant of deliverance had been stamped on the rugged, cadaverous visage by a beautiful light. Not of peace, nor of joy, nor of grief, but of hope. Hope had been the last emotion of Hellbent Wade. "Collie, listen," said the old rancher in deep and trembling tones. "When a man's dead, what he's been comes to us with startling truth. Wade was the whitest man I ever knew. He had a queer idea, a twist in his mind, and it was that his steps were bent toward hell. He imagined that everywhere he traveled there he fetched hell. But he was wrong. His own trouble led him to the trouble of others. He saw through life, and he was as big in his hope for the good as he was terrible in his dealing with the bad. I never saw his like. He loved you, Collie, better than you ever knew. Better than Jack or Wills or me. You know what the Bible says about him who gives his life for his friend. Well, Wade was my friend, and Jack's, only we never could see. And he was Will's friend. And to you he must have been more than words can tell. We all know what child's play it would have been for Wade to kill Jack without being hurt himself. But he wouldn't do it. So he spared me and Jack, and I reckon himself. Somehow he made Jack fight and die like a man. God only knows how he did that. But it saved me from hell, and you and Wills from misery. Wade could have taken you from me, and Jack. He had only to tell you his secret, and he wouldn't. He saw how you loved me, as if you were my real child. But, Collie, lass, it was he who was your father." With bursting heart, Columbine fell upon her knees beside that cold, still form. Belllounds softly left the room and closed the door behind him. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nature was prodigal with her colours that autumn. The frosts came late, so that the leaves did not gradually change their green. One day, as if by magic, there was gold among the green, and in another there was purple and red. Then the hilltops blazed with their crowns of aspen groves, and the slopes of sage shone mellow grey in the sunlight, and the vines on the stone fences straggled away in lines of bronze, and the patches of ferns under the cliffs faded fast, and the great rock slides and black timbered reaches stood out in their sombre shades. Columbines bloomed in all the dells among the spruces, beautiful stalks with heavy blossoms, the sweetest and palest of blue-white flowers. Motionless, they lifted their faces to the light. Out in the aspen groves, where the grass was turning gold, the columbines blew gracefully in the wind, nodding and swaying. The most exquisite and finest of these columbines hid in the shaded nooks, star-sweet in the silent gloom of the woods. Wade's last few whispered words to Moore had been interpreted that the hunter desired to be buried among the columbines in the aspen grove on the slope above Sage Valley. Here, then, had been made his grave. One day Belllounds sent Columbine to fetch Moore down to White Slides. It was a warm Indian summer afternoon, and the old rancher sat out on the porch in his shirt sleeves. His hair was white now, but no other change was visible in him. No restraint attended his greeting to the cowboy. "Wills, I reckon I'd be glad if you'd take your old job as foreman of White Slides," he said. "Are you asking me?" queried Moore eagerly. "Well, I reckon so." "Yes, I'll come," replied the cowboy. "What'll your dad say?" "I don't know. That worries me. He's coming to visit me. I heard from him again lately, and he means to take stage for Kremmling soon." "Well, that's fine. I'll be glad to see him. Wills, you're going to be a big cattleman before you know it. Hey, Collie?" "If you say so, Dad, it'll come true," replied Columbine with her hand on his shoulder. "Wills, you'll be runnin' White Slides Ranch before long, unless Collie runs you. Ha ha!" Collie could not reply to this startling announcement from the old rancher, and Moore appeared distressed with embarrassment. "Well, I reckon you young folks had better ride down to Kremmlin' and get married." This kindly, matter-of-fact suggestion completely stunned the cowboy, and all Columbine could do was to gaze at the rancher. "Say, I hope I ain't intrudin' my wishes on a young couple that's got over dyin' for each other," dryly continued Belllounds with his huge smile. "Dad!" cried Columbine, and then she threw her arms around him and buried her head on his shoulder. "Well, well, I reckon that answers that," he said, holding her close. "Moore, she's yours, with my blessin' and all I have. And you must understand I'm glad things have worked out to your good and to Collie's happiness. Life's not over for me yet, but I reckon the storms are past, thank God. We learn as we live. I'd hold it unworthy not to look forward and to hope. I'm wanting peace and quiet now, with grandchildren around me in my old age. So ride along to Kremmlin' and hurry home." The evening of the day Columbine came home to White Slides, the bride of Wilson Moore, she slipped away from the simple festivities in her honor and climbed to the aspen grove on the hill to spend a little while beside the grave of her father. The afterglow of sunset burned dull gold and rose in the western sky, rendering glorious the veil of purple over the ranges. Down in the lowlands twilight had come, softly gray. The owls were hooting, a coyote barked, from far away floated the mourn of a wolf. Under the aspens it was silent and lonely and sad. The leaves quivered without any sound of rustling. Columbine's heart was full of a happiness that she longed to express somehow, there beside this lonely grave. It was what she owed the strange man who slept here in the shadows. Grief abided with her, and always there would be an eternal remorse and regret. Yet she had loved him. She had been his, all unconsciously. His life had been terrible, but it had been great. As the hours of quiet thinking had multiplied, Columbine had grown in her divination of Wade's meaning. His had been the spirit of man lighting the dark places. His had been the ruthless hand against all evil, terrible to destroy. Her father! After all, how closely was she linked to the past! How closely protected, even in the hours of most helpless despair! Thus she understood him. Love was the food of life, and hope was its spirituality, and beauty was its reward to the seeing eye. Wade had lived these great virtues, even while he had earned a tragic name. "I will live them. I will have faith and hope and love, for I am his daughter," she said. A faint, cool breeze strayed through the aspens, rustling the leaves whisperingly, and the slender columbines, gleaming pale in the twilight, lifted their sweet faces. End of chapter 20. Recording by Mary Bard, Derby, England. End of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey.